breach, and their crossbows were snapping. "Closer!" Skeet shouted, and his archers pushed through the hedge and ran to within 100 paces of the town ditch, where they again loosed their long war bows and slashed their arrows into the embrasures. Some defenders were dying now, for they had to show themselves to shoot their crossbows down into the crowd of men who jostled at the foot of the 4 ladders that had been laid against the breach or walls. Men-at-arms climbed, a forked pole shoved one ladder back, and Thomas twitched his left hand to change his aim and released his fingers to drive an arrow into the breast of a man pushing on the pole. The man had been covered by a shield held by a companion, but the shield shifted for an instant, and Thomas's arrow was the first through the small gap, though 2 more followed before the dying man's last heartbeat ended. Other men succeeded in toppling the ladder. "St. George!" the English shouted, but the saint must have been sleeping, for he gave the attackers no help. More stones were hurled from the ramparts. Then a great mass of flaming straw was heaved into the crowded attackers. A man succeeded in reaching the top of the breach, but was immediately killed by an axe that split his helmet and skull in 2. He slumped on the rungs, blocking the ascent, and the Earl tried to haul him free, but was struck on the head by one of the boulders and collapsed at the ladder's foot. 2 of his men-at-arms carried the stunned Earl back to the camp, and his departure took the spirit from the attackers. They no longer shouted. The arrows still flew, and men still tried to climb the wall, but the defenders sensed they had repelled this 6th attack, and their crossbow bolts spat relentlessly. It was then Thomas saw the blackbird on the tower above the gate. He laid the steel arrow tip on her breast, raised the bow a fraction, and then jerked his bow hand so that the arrow flew wild. Too pretty to kill, he told himself, and knew he was a fool for thinking it. She shot her bolt and vanished. A half-dozen arrows clattered onto the tower where she had been standing, but Thomas reckoned all 6 archers had let her shoot before they loosed. "Jesus wept," Skeet said. The attack had failed, and the men-at-arms were running from the crossbow bolts. One ladder still rested against the breach, with the dead man entangled in its upper rungs. "Back!" Skeet shouted. "Back!" The archers ran, pursued by quarrels, until they could push through the hedge and drop into the ditch. The defenders were cheering, and 2 men bared their backsides on the gate tower and briefly shoved their asses towards the defeated English. "Bastards," Skeet said. "Bastards." He was not used to failure. "There has to be a bloody way in," he growled. Thomas unlooped the string from his bow and placed it under his helmet. "I told you how to get in," he told Skeet. "Told you at dawn." Skeet looked at Thomas for a long time. "We tried it, lad." "I got to the stakes, Will. I promise I did. I got through them." "So tell me again," Skeet said, and Thomas did. He crouched in the ditch under the jeers of La Roche-Derrien's defenders, and he told Will Skeet how to unlock the town, and Skeet listened, because the Yorkshireman had learned to trust Thomas of Hookton. Thomas had been in Brittany for 3 years now, and though Brittany was not France, its usurping duke brought a constant succession of Frenchmen to be killed, and Thomas had discovered he had a skill for killing. It was not just that he was a good archer. The army was full of men who were as good as he, and there was a handful who were better. But he had discovered he could sense what the enemy was doing. He would watch them, watch their eyes, see where they were looking, and as often as not he anticipated an enemy move and was ready to greet it with an arrow. It was like a game, but one where he knew the rules and they did not. It helped that William Skeet trusted him. Skeet had been unwilling to recruit Thomas when they first met by the jail in Dorchester, where Skeet was testing a score of thieves and murderers to see how well they could shoot a bow. He needed recruits, and the king needed archers, so men who would otherwise have faced the gallows were being pardoned if they would serve abroad, and fully half of Skeet's men were such felons. Thomas, Skeet had reckoned, would never fit in with such rogues. He had taken Thomas's right hand, seen the calluses on the 2 bow fingers, which said he was an archer, but then he had tapped the boy's soft palm. "What have you been doing?" Skeet had asked. "My father wanted me to be a priest." "A priest, eh?" Skeet had been scornful. "Well, you can pray for us, I suppose. I can kill for you, too." Skeet had eventually let Thomas join the band, not least because the boy brought his own horse. At first, Skeet thought Thomas of Hookton was little more than another wild fool looking for adventure. A clever fool, to be sure, but Thomas had taken to the life of an archer in Brittany with alacrity. The real business of the Civil War was plunder, and day after day Skeet's men rode into land that gave fealty to the supporters of Duke Charles, and they burned the farms, stole the harvest, and took the livestock. A lord whose peasants cannot pay rent is a lord who cannot afford to hire soldiers, so Skeet's men-at-arms and mounted archers were loosed on the enemy's land like a plague. And Thomas loved the life. He was young, and his task was not just to fight the enemy, but to ruin him. He burned farms, poisoned wells, stole seed grain, broke ploughs, fired the mills, ring-barked the orchards, and lived off his plunder. Skeet's men were the lords of Brittany, a scourge from hell, and the French-speaking villagers in the east of the duchy called them the Elcar, which meant the devil's horsemen. Once in a while, an enemy war band would seek to trap them, and Thomas had learned that the English archer, with his great long war bow, was the king of those skirmishes. The enemy hated the archers. If they captured an English bowman, they killed him. A man-at-arms might be imprisoned, a lord would be ransomed, but an archer was always murdered. Tortured first, then murdered. Thomas thrived on the life, and Skeet had learned the lad was clever, certainly clever enough to know better than to fall asleep one night when he should have been standing guard, and for that offense Skeet had thumped the daylights out of him. "You were goddamn drunk," he had accused Thomas, then beat him thoroughly, using his fists like blacksmith's hammers. He had broken Thomas's nose, cracked a rib, and called him a stinking piece of Satan's shit. But at the end of it, Will Skeet saw that the boy was still grinning, and 6 months later he made Thomas into a vintner, which meant he was in charge of 20 other. Those 20 were nearly all older than Thomas, but none seemed to mind his promotion, for they reckoned he was different. Most archers wore their hair cropped short, but Thomas's hair was flamboyantly long and wrapped with bow cords, so it fell in a long black plait to his waist. He was clean-shaven and dressed only in black. Such affectations could have made him unpopular, but he worked hard, had a quick wit, and was generous. He was still odd, though. All archers wore talismans, maybe a cheap metal pendant showing a saint, or a dried hare's foot, but Thomas had a desiccated dog's paw hanging round his neck, which he claimed was the hand of Saint Guinevere, and no one dared dispute him, because he was the most learned man in Skeet's band. He spoke French like a nobleman and Latin like a priest, and Skeet's archers were perversely proud of him because of those accomplishments. Now, 3 years after joining Will Skeet's band, Thomas was one of his chief archers. Skeet even asked his advice sometimes. He rarely took it, but he asked, and Thomas still had the dog's paw, a crooked nose, and an impudent grin. And now he had an idea how to get into La Roche-Derrien. That afternoon, when the dead man-at-arms with the split skull was still tangled in the abandoned ladder, Sir Simon Jekyll rode towards the town, and there trotted his horse back and forth beside the small, dark-feathered crossbow bolts that marked the furthest range of the defenders' weapons. His squire, a daft boy with a slack jaw and puzzled eyes, watched from a distance. The squire held Sir Simon's lance, and should any warrior in the town accept the implicit challenge of Sir Simon's mocking presence, the squire would give his master the lance, and the two horsemen would fight on the pasture until one or the other yielded. And it would not be Sir Simon, for he was as skilled a knight as any in the Earl of Northampton's army. And the poorest. His destrier was 10 years old, hard-mouthed and sway-backed. His saddle, which was high in pommel and cantle so that it held him firm in its grip, had belonged to his father, while his hauberk, a tunic of mail that covered him from neck to knees, had belonged to his grandfather. His sword was over 100 years old, heavy, and would not keep its edge. His lance had warped in the wet winter weather, while his helmet, which hung from his pommel, was an old steel pot with a worn leather lining. His shield, with its escutcheon of a mailed fist clutching a war hammer, was battered and faded. His mail gauntlets, like the rest of his armor, were rusting, which was why his squire had a thick, reddened ear and a frightened face. though the real reason for the rust was not that the squire did not try to clean the mail, but that Sir Simon could not afford the vinegar and fine sand that was used to scour the steel. He was poor and bitter and ambitious, and good. No one denied he was good. He had won the tournament at Tewkesbury and received a purse of £40. At Gloucester his victory had been rewarded by a fine suit of armour. At Chelmsford it had been £15 and a fine saddle, and at Canterbury he had half-hacked a Frenchman to death before being given a gilded cup filled with coins. But where were all those trophies now? In the hands of the bankers and lawyers and merchants who had a lien on the Berkshire estate that Sir Simon had inherited 2 years before, though in truth his inheritance had been nothing but debt, and the moment his father was buried the moneylenders had closed on Sir Simon like hounds on a wounded deer. Marry an heiress, his mother had advised, and she had paraded a dozen women for her son's inspection, but Sir Simon was determined his wife should be as beautiful as he was handsome. And he was handsome. He knew that. He would stare into his mother's mirror and admire his reflection. He had thick, fair hair, a broad face, and a short beard. At Chester, where he had unhorsed 3 knights inside 4 minutes, men had mistaken him for the king, who was reputed to fight anonymously in tournaments, and Sir Simon was not going to throw away his good royal looks on some wrinkled hag just because she had money. He would marry a woman worthy of himself, but that ambition would not pay the estate's debts, and so Sir Simon, to defend himself against his creditors, had sought a letter of protection from King Edward III. That letter shielded Sir Simon from all legal proceedings so long as he served the king in a foreign war. And when Sir Simon had crossed the Channel, taking 6 men-at-arms, a dozen archers, and a slack-jawed squire from his encumbered estate, he had left his creditors helpless in England. Sir Simon had also brought with him a certainty that he would soon capture some French or Breton nobleman whose ransom would be sufficient to pay off all he owed. But so far the winter campaign had not yielded a single prisoner of rank, and so little plunder that the army was now on half rations. And how many well-born prisoners could he expect to take in a miserable town like La Roche-Derrien? It was a shithole. Yet he rode up and down beneath its walls, hoping some knight would take the challenge and ride from the town's southern gate that had so far resisted 6 English assaults. But instead the defenders jeered him and called him a coward for staying out of their crossbows' range, and the insults piqued Sir Simon's pride, so that he rode closer to the walls, his horse's hoofs sometimes clattering on one of the fallen quarrels. Men shot at him, but the bolts fell well short, and it was Sir Simon's turn to jeer. "He's just a bloody fool," Jake said, watching from the English camp. Jake was one of William Skeet's felons, a murderer who had been saved from the gallows at Exeter. He was cross-eyed, yet still managed to shoot straighter than most men. "Now what's he doing?" Sir Simon had stopped his horse and was facing the gate, so that the men who watched thought that perhaps a Frenchman was coming to challenge the English knight who taunted them. Instead, they saw that a lone crossbowman was standing on the gate turret and beckoning Sir Simon forward, daring him to come within range. Only a fool would respond to such a dare, and Sir Simon dutifully responded. He was 25 years old, bitter and brave, and he reckoned a display of careless arrogance would dishearten the besieged garrison and encourage the dispirited English, and so he spurred the destrier deep into the killing ground where the French bolts had torn the heart out of the English attacks. No crossbowman fired now. There was just the lone figure standing on the gate tower, and Sir Simon, riding to within 100 yards, saw it was the Blackbird. This was the first time Sir Simon had seen the woman every archer called the Blackbird, and he was close enough to perceive that she was indeed a beauty. She stood straight, slender and tall, cloaked against the winter wind, but with her long black hair loose like a young girl's. She offered him a mocking bow, and Sir Simon responded, bending awkwardly in the tight saddle. Then he watched as she picked up her crossbow and put it to her shoulder. "And when we're inside the town," Sir Simon thought, "I'll make you pay for this. You'll be flat on your arse, Blackbird, and I'll be on top." He stood his horse quite still, a lone horseman in the French slaughter ground, daring her to aim straight and knowing she would not. and when she missed, he would give her a mocking salute, and the French would take it as a bad omen. But what if she did aim straight? Sir Simon was tempted to lift the awkward helmet from his saddle's pommel, but resisted the impulse. He had dared the blackbird to do her worst, and he could show no nerves in front of a woman, and so he waited as she levelled the bow. The town's defenders were watching her and doubtless praying, or perhaps making wagers. "Come on, you bitch," he said under his breath. It was cold, but there was sweat on his forehead. She paused, pushed the black hair from her face, then rested the bow on a crenellation and aimed again. Sir Simon kept his head up and his gaze straight. Just a woman, he told himself. Probably could not hit a wagon at 5 paces. His horse shivered, and he reached out to pat its neck. "Be going soon, boy," he told it. The blackbird, watched by a score of defenders, closed her eyes and shot. Sir Simon saw the quarrel as a small black blur against the grey sky and the grey stones of the church towers showing above La Roche-Derrian's walls. He knew the quarrel would go wide, knew it with an absolute certainty. She was a woman, for God's sake! And that was why he did not move as he saw the blur coming straight for him. He could not believe it. He was waiting for the quarrel to slide to left or right, or to plough into the frost-hardened ground, but instead it was coming unerringly towards his breast, and at the very last instant he jerked up the heavy shield and ducked his head and felt a huge thump on his left arm as the bolt slammed home to throw him hard against the saddle's cantle. The bolt hit the shield so hard that it split through the willow boards, and its point gouged a deep cut through the mail sleeve and into his forearm. The French were cheering, and Sir Simon, knowing that other crossbowmen might now try to finish what the blackbird had begun, pressed his knee into his destrier's flank, and the beast obediently turned, and then responded to the spurs. "I'm alive!" he said aloud, as if that would silence the French jubilation. "Goddamn bitch," he thought. He would pay her right enough, pay her till she squealed, and he curbed his horse, not wanting to look as though he fled. An hour later, after his squire had put a bandage over the slashed forearm, Sir Simon had convinced himself that he had scored a victory. He had dared, he had survived. It had been a demonstration of courage, and he lived, and for that he reckoned he was a hero, and he expected a hero's welcome as he walked toward the tent that housed the army's commander, the Earl of Northampton. The tent was made from 2 sails, their linen yellow and patched and threadbare after years of service at sea. They made a shabby shelter, but that was typical of William Boone, Earl of Northampton, who, though cousin to the king and as rich a man as any in England, despised gaudiness. The Earl, indeed, looked as patched and threadbare as the sails that made his tent. He was a short and squat man, with a face, men said, like the backside of a bull, but the face mirrored the Earl's soul, which was blunt, brave, and straightforward. The army liked William Boone, Earl of Northampton, because he was as tough as they were themselves. Now, as Sir Simon ducked into the tent, the Earl's curly brown hair was half covered with a bandage, where the boulder thrown from La Roche-Derrian's wall had split his helmet and driven a ragged edge of steel into his scalp. He greeted Sir Simon sourly. "Tired of life?" "The silly bitch shut her eyes when she pulled the trigger," Sir Simon said, oblivious to the Earl's tone. "She still aimed well," the Earl said angrily, "and that will put heart into the bastards. God knows they need no encouragement." "I'm alive, my lord," Sir Simon said cheerfully. "She wanted to kill me. She failed. The bear lives and the dogs go hungry." He waited for the Earl's companions to congratulate him, but they avoided his eyes, and he interpreted their sullen silence as jealousy. Sir Simon was a bloody fool, the Earl thought, and shivered. He might not have minded the cold so much had the army been enjoying success, but for 2 months the English and their Breton allies had stumbled from failure to farce, and the 6 assaults on La Roche-Derrian had plumbed the depths of misery. So now the Earl had called a council of war to suggest one final assault, this one to be made that same evening. Every other attack had been in the forenoon, but perhaps a surprise escalade in the dying winter light would take the defenders by surprise. Only what small advantages that surprise might bring had been spoiled, because Sir Simon's foolhardiness must have given the townsfolk a new confidence, and there was little confidence among the Earl's war captains who had gathered under the yellow sailcloth. 4 of those captains were knights who, like Sir Simon, led their own men to war, but the others were mercenary soldiers who had contracted their men to the Earl's service. 3 were Bretons, who wore the white ermine badge of the Duke of Brittany and led men loyal to the de Montfort Duke, while the others were English captains, all of them commoners who had grown hard in war. William Skeet was there, and next to him was Richard Tocham, who had begun his service as a man-at-arms and now led 140 knights and 90 archers in the Earl's service. Neither man had ever fought in a tournament, nor would they ever be invited, yet both were wealthier than Sir Simon, and that rankled. "My hounds of war," the Earl of Northampton called the independent captains, and the Earl liked them, but then the Earl had a curious taste for vulgar company. He might be cousin to England's king, but William Boone happily drank with men like Skeet and Tocham, ate with them, spoke English with them, hunted with them, and trusted them, and Sir Simon felt excluded from that friendship. If any man in this army should have been an intimate of the Earl, it was Sir Simon, a noted champion of tournaments, but Northampton would rather roll in the gutter with men like Skeet. "How's the rain?" the Earl asked. "Starting again," Sir Simon answered, jerking his head at the tent's roof, against which the rain pattered fitfully. "It'll clear," Skeet said dourly. He rarely called the Earl my lord, addressing him instead as an equal, which, to Sir Simon's amazement, the Earl seemed to like. "And it's only spitting," the Earl said, peering out from the tent and letting in a swirl of damp, cold air. "Bowstrings will pluck in this." "So will crossbow cords," Richard Tocham interjected. "Bastards," he added. What made the English failure so galling was that La Roche-Derrien's defenders were not soldiers, but townsfolk, fishermen and boat builders, carpenters and masons, and even the Blackbird, a woman. "And the rain might stop," Tocham went on, "but the ground will be slick. It'll be bad footing under the walls." "Don't go tonight," Will Skeet advised. "Let my boys go in by the river tomorrow morning." The Earl rubbed the wound on his scalp. For a week now he had assaulted La Roche-Derrien's southern wall, and he still believed his men could take those ramparts. Yet he also sensed the pessimism among his hounds of war. One more repulse, with another 20 or 30 dead, would leave his army dispirited and with the prospect of trailing back to Finisterre with nothing accomplished. "Tell me again," he said. Skeet wiped his nose on his leather sleeve. "At low tide," he said, "there's a way round the north wall. One of my lads was down there last night." "We tried it 3 days ago," one of the knights objected. "You tried the downriver side," Skeet said. "I want to go upriver." "That side has stakes, just like the other," the Earl said. "Loose," Skeet responded. One of the Breton captains translated the exchange for his companions. "My boy pulled a stake clean out," Skeet went on, "and he reckons half a dozen others will lift or break. They're old oak trunks, he says, instead of elm, and they're rotted through." "How deep is the mud?" the Earl asked. "Up to his knees." La Roche-Derrien's wall encompassed the west, south, and east of the town, while the northern side was defended by the river Joudie, and where the semicircular wall met the river, the townsfolk had planted huge stakes in the mud to block access at low tide. Skeet was now suggesting there was a way through those rotted stakes, but when the Earl's men had tried to do the same thing at the eastern side of the town, the attackers had got bogged down in the mud, and the townsfolk had picked them off with bolts. It had been a worse slaughter than the repulses in front of the southern gate. "But there's still a wall on the riverbank," the Earl pointed out. "Aye," Skeet allowed, "but the silly bastards have broken it down in places. They've built quays there, and there's one right close to the loose stakes. So your men will have to remove the stakes and climb the quays, all under the gaze of men on the wall?" the Earl asked skeptically. "They can do it," Skeet said firmly. The Earl still reckoned his best chance of success was to close his archers on the south gate and pray that their arrows would keep the defenders cowering, while his men-at-arms assaulted the breach. Yet that, he conceded, was the plan that had failed earlier in the day, and on the day before that. And he had, he knew, only a day or two left. He possessed fewer than 3,000 men, and a third of those were sick, and if he could not find them shelter, he would have to march back west with his tail between his legs. He needed a town, any town, even La Roche-Derrien. Will Skeet saw the worries on the Earl's broad face. "My lad was within 15 paces of the quay last night," he asserted. "He could have been inside the town and opened the gate." "So why didn't he?" Sir Simon could not resist asking. "Christ's bones," he went on, "but I'd have been inside." "You're not an archer," Skeet said sourly, then made the sign of the cross. At Gangon, one of Skeet's archers had been captured by the defenders, who had stripped the hated bowman naked, then cut him to pieces on the rampart where the besiegers could see his long death. His 2 bow fingers had been severed first, then his manhood, and the man had screamed like a pig being gelded as he bled to death on the battlements. The Earl gestured for a servant to replenish the cups of mulled wine. "Would you lead this attack, Will?" he asked. "Not me," Skeet said. "I'm too old to wade through boggy mud. I'll let the lad who went past the stakes last night lead them in. He's a good boy, so he is. He's a clever bastard, but an odd one. He was going to be a priest, he was, only he met me and came to his senses." The Earl was plainly tempted by the idea. He toyed with the hilt of his sword, then nodded. "I think we should meet your clever bastard." "Is he near?" "Left him outside," Skeet said, then twisted on his stool. "Tom, you savage! Come in here!" Thomas stooped into the Earl's tent, where the gathered captains saw a tall, long-legged young man, dressed entirely in black, all but for his mail coat and the red cross sewn onto his tunic. All the English troops wore that cross of St. George, so that in a melee they would know who was a friend and who an enemy. The young man bowed to the Earl, who realized he had noticed this archer before, which was hardly surprising, for Thomas was a striking-looking man. He wore his black hair in a pigtail, tied with bowcord. He had a long, bony nose that was crooked, a clean-shaven chin, and watchful, clever eyes, though perhaps the most noticeable thing about him was that he was clean. That, and on his shoulder, the great bow that was one of the longest the Earl had seen, and not only long, but painted black, while mounted on the outer belly of the bow was a curious silver plate, which seemed to have a coat of arms engraved on it. There was vanity here, the Earl thought, vanity and pride, and he approved of both things. "For a man who was up to his knees in river mud last night," the Earl said with a smile, "you're remarkably clean." "I washed, my lord." "You'll catch cold," the Earl warned him. "What's your name?" "Thomas of Hookton, my lord." "So tell me what you found last night, Thomas of Hookton." Thomas told the same tale as Will Skeet, how, after dark, and as the tide fell, he had waded out into the Jaudi's mud. He had found the fence of stakes ill-maintained, rotting and loose, and he had lifted one out of its socket, wriggled through the gap, and gone a few paces towards the nearest quay. "I was close enough, my lord, to hear a woman singing," he said. The woman had been singing a song that his own mother had crooned to him when he was small, and he had been struck by that oddity. The Earl frowned when Thomas finished, not because he disapproved of anything the archer had said, but because the scalp wound that had left him unconscious for an hour was throbbing. "What were you doing at the river last night?" he asked, mainly to give himself more time to think about the idea. Thomas said nothing. "Another man's woman," Skeet eventually answered for Thomas. "That's what he was doing, my lord. Another man's woman." The assembled men laughed, all but Sir Simon Jekyll, who looked sourly at the blushing Thomas. The bastard was a mere archer, yet he was wearing a better coat of mail than Sir Simon could afford, and he had a confidence that stank of impudence. Sir Simon shuddered. There was an unfairness to life which he did not understand. Archers from the shires were capturing horses and weapons and armor, while he, a champion of tournaments, had not managed anything more valuable than a pair of goddamn boots. He felt an irresistible urge to deflate this tall, composed archer. "One alert sentinel, my lord." Sir Simon spoke to the Earl in Norman French, so that only the handful of well-born men in the tent would understand him. "And this boy will be dead, and our attack will be floundering in river mud." Thomas gave Sir Simon a very level look, insolent in its lack of expression, then answered in fluent French. "We should attack in the dark," he said, then turned back to the Earl. The tide will be low just before dawn tomorrow, my lord. The Earl looked at him with surprise. How did you learn French? From my father, my lord. Do we know him? I doubt it, my lord. The Earl did not pursue the subject. He bit his lip and rubbed the pommel of his sword, a habit when he was thinking. All well and good if you get inside, Richard Tocham, seated on a milking stool next to Will Skeet, growled at Thomas. Tocham led the largest of the independent bands and had on that account a greater authority than the rest of the captains. But what do you do when you're inside? Thomas nodded as though he had expected the question. I doubt we can reach a gate, he said, but if I can put a score of archers onto the wall beside the river, then they can protect it while ladders are placed. And I've got 2 ladders, Skeet added. They'll do. The Earl still rubbed the pommel of his sword. When we tried to attack by the river before, he said, we got trapped in the mud. It'll be just as deep where you want to go. Hurdles, my lord, Thomas said. I found some in a farm. Hurdles were fence sections made of woven willow that could make a quick pen for sheep or could be laid flat on mud to provide men with footing. I told you he was clever, Will Skeet said proudly. Went to Oxford, didn't you, Tom? When I was too young to know better, Thomas said dryly. The Earl laughed. He liked this boy, and he could see why Skeet had such faith in him. Tomorrow morning, Thomas? He asked. Better than dusk tonight, my lord. They'll still be lively at dusk. Thomas gave Sir Simon an expressionless glance, intimating that the night's display of stupid bravery would have quickened the defenders' spirits. Then tomorrow morning it is, the Earl said. He turned to Tocham. But keep your boys closed on the south gate today. I want them to think we're coming there again. He looked back to Thomas. What's the badge on your bow, boy? Just something I found, my lord, Thomas lied, handing the bow to the Earl, who had held out his hand. In truth, he had cut the silver badge out of the crushed chalice that he had found under his father's robes, then pinned the metal to the front of the bow, where his left hand had worn the silver almost smooth. The Earl peered at the device. A Yale? I think that's what the beast is called, my lord, Thomas said, pretending ignorance. Not the badge of anyone I know, the Earl said, then tried to flex the bow and raised his eyebrows in surprise at its strength. He gave the black shaft back to Thomas, then dismissed him. I wish you Godspeed in the morning, Thomas of Hookton. My lord, Thomas said, and bowed. I'll go with him with your permission, Skeet said, and the Earl nodded, then watched the 2 men leave. If we do get inside, he told his remaining captains, then for God's sake don't let your men cry havoc. Hold their leashes tight. I intend to keep this town, and I don't want the townsfolk hating us. Kill when you must, but I don't want an orgy of blood. He looked at their skeptical faces. I'll be putting one of you in charge of the garrison here, so make it easy for yourselves. Hold them tight. The captains grunted, knowing how hard it would be to keep their men from a full sack of the town. But before any of them could respond to the Earl's hopeful wishes, Sir Simon stood. My lord, a request. The Earl shrugged. Try me. Would you let me and my men lead the ladder party? The Earl seemed surprised at the request. You think Skeet cannot manage on his own? I'm sure he can, my lord, Sir Simon said humbly, but I still beg the honour. Better Sir Simon Jekyll dead than Will Skeet, the Earl thought. He nodded. Of course, of course. The captain said nothing. What honour was there in being the first onto a wall that another man had captured? No, the bastard did not want honour. He wanted to be well placed to find the richest plunder in town. But none of them voiced this thought. They were captains, but Sir Simon was a knight, even if a penniless one. The Earl's army threatened an attack for the rest of that short winter's day, but it never came, and the citizens of La Roche-Derrien dared to hope that the worst of their ordeal was over, but made preparations in case the English did try again the next day. They counted their crossbow bolts, stacked more boulders on the ramparts, and fed the fires which boiled the pots of water that were poured onto the English. Heat the wretches up, the town's priest had said, and the townsfolk liked that jest. They were winning, they knew, and they reckoned their ordeal must finish soon, for the English would surely be running out of food. All La Roche-Derrien had to do was endure, and then receive the praise and thanks of Duke Charles. The small rain stopped at nightfall. The townsfolk went to their beds, but kept their weapons ready. The sentries lit watchfires behind the walls and gazed into the dark. It was night, it was winter, it was cold, and the besiegers had one last chance. The Blackbird had been christened Jeannette Marie Alévi, and when she was 15, her parents had taken her to Guingamp for the annual tournament of the apples. Her father was not an aristocrat, so the family could not sit in the enclosure beneath Saint-Laurent's tower. But they found a place nearby, and Louis Alévi made certain his daughter was visible by placing their chairs on the farm wagon which had carried them from La Roche-Derrien. Jeanette's father was a prosperous shipmaster and wine merchant, though his fortune in business had not been mirrored in life. One son had died when a cut finger turned septic, and his second son had drowned on a voyage to Corunna. Jeanette was now his only child. There was calculation in the visit to Guingamp. The nobility of Brittany, at least those who favoured an alliance with France, assembled at the tournament where, for 4 days, in front of a crowd that came as much for the fair as for the fighting, they displayed their talents with sword and lance. Jeanette found much of it tedious, for the preambles to each fight were long and often out of earshot. Knights paraded endlessly, their extravagant plumes nodding, but after a while there would be a brief thunder of hoofs, a clash of metal, a cheer, and one knight would be tumbled in the grass. It was customary for every victorious knight to prick an apple with his lance and present it to whichever woman in the crowd attracted him, and that was why her father had taken the farm wagon to Guingamp. After 4 days, Jeanette had 18 apples and the enmity of a score of better-born girls. Her parents took her back to La Roche-Derrien and waited. They had displayed their wares, and now the buyers could find their way to the lavish house beside the River Jaudy. From the front, the house seemed small, but go through the archway, and a visitor found himself in a wide courtyard, reaching down to a stone quay, where Monsieur Alévi's smaller boats could be moored at the top of the tide. The courtyard shared a wall with the church of Saint-Renan, and because Monsieur Alévi had donated the tower to the church, he had been permitted to drive an archway through the wall, so that his family did not need to step into the street when they went to Mass. The house told any suitor that this was a wealthy family, and the presence of the parish priest at the supper table told him it was a devout family. Jeanette was to be no aristocrat's plaything. She was to be a wife. A dozen men condescended to visit the Alévi house, but it was Henri Chenier, Comte d'Armorique, who won the apple. He was a prime catch, for he was nephew to Charles of Blois, who was himself a nephew to King Philip of France, and it was Charles whom the French recognized as Duke and ruler of Brittany. The Duke allowed Henri Chenier to present his fiancée, but afterwards advised his nephew to discard her. The girl was a merchant's daughter, scarce more than a peasant, though even the Duke admitted she was a beauty. Her hair was shining black, her face was unflawed by the pox, and she had all her teeth. She was graceful, so that a Dominican friar in the Duke's court clasped his hands and exclaimed that Jeanette was the living image of the Madonna. The Duke agreed she was beautiful, but so what? Many women were beautiful. Any tavern in Guingamp, he said, could throw up a 2-livre whore who could make most wives look like hogs. It was not the job of a wife to be beautiful, but to be rich. "Make the girl your mistress," he advised his nephew, and virtually ordered Henri to marry an heiress from Picardy. But the heiress was a pox-faced slattern, and the Count of Armorica was besotted by Jeanette's beauty, and so he defied his uncle. He married the merchant's daughter in the chapel of his castle at Plabennec, which lay in Finistère, the world's end. The Duke reckoned his nephew had listened to too many troubadours, but the Count and his new wife were happy, and a year after their wedding, when Jeanette was 16, their son was born. They named him Charles, after the Duke, but if the Duke was complimented, he said nothing. He refused to receive Jeanette again and treated his nephew coldly. Later that same year, the English came in force to support Jean de Montfort, whom they recognized as the Duke of Brittany, and the King of France sent reinforcements to his nephew, Charles, whom he recognized as the real Duke, and so the civil war began in earnest. The Count of Armorica insisted that his wife and baby son went back to her father's house in La Roche-Derrière because the castle at Plabennec was small, in ill repair, and too close to the invaders' forces. That summer the castle fell to the English just as Jeanette's husband had feared, and the following year the King of England spent the campaigning season in Brittany, and his army pushed back the forces of Charles, Duke of Brittany. There was no one great battle, but a series of bloody skirmishes, and in one of them, a ragged affair fought between the hedgerows of a steep valley, Jeanette's husband was wounded. He had lifted the facepiece of his helmet to shout encouragement to his men, and an arrow had gone clean through his mouth. His servants brought the Count to the house beside the river Jaudy, where he took 5 days to die. 5 days of constant pain, during which he was unable to eat and scarce able to breathe, as the wound festered and the blood congealed in his gullet. He was 28 years old, a champion of tournaments, and he wept like a child at the end. He choked to death, and Jeanette screamed in frustrated anger and grief. Then began Jeanette's time of sorrow. She was a widow, la veuve Chenier, and not 6 months after her husband's death, she became an orphan when both her parents died of the bloody flux. She was just 18, and her son, the Count of Armorica, was 2. But Jeanette had inherited her father's wealth, and she determined to use it to strike back at the hated English who had killed her husband. And so she began outfitting 2 ships that could prey on English shipping. End of Side 3. Side 4. Monsieur Bellin, who had been her father's lawyer, advised against spending money on the ships. Jeanette's fortune would not last forever, the lawyer said, and nothing soaked up cash like outfitting warships that rarely made money unless by luck. Better, he said, to use the ships for trade. The merchants in Lannion are making a fine profit on Spanish wine, he suggested. He had a cold, for it was winter, and he sneezed. A very fine profit, he said wistfully. He spoke in Breton, though both he and Jeanette could, if needs be, speak French. I do not want Spanish wine, Jeanette said coldly, but English souls. No profit in those, my lady, Bellin said. He found it strange to call Jeanette my lady. He had known her since she was a child, and she had always been little Jeanette to him, but she had married and become an aristocratic widow, and a widow, moreover, with a temper. You cannot sell English souls, Bellin pointed out mildly. Except to the devil, Jeanette said, crossing herself. But I don't need Spanish wine, Bellin. We have the rents. The rents, Bellin said mockingly. He was tall, thin, scanty-haired, and clever. He had served Jeanette's father well and long, and was resentful that the merchant had left him nothing in his will. Everything had gone to Jeanette, except for a small bequest to the monks at Pontrier, so they would say masses for the dead man's soul. Bellin hid his resentment. Nothing comes from Plabennec, he told Jeanette. The English are there, and how long do you think the rents will come from your father's farms? The English will take them soon. An English army had occupied unwalled Tréguier, which was only an hour's walk northwards, and they had pulled down the cathedral tower there because some crossbowmen had shot at them from its summit. Bellin hoped the English would retreat soon, for it was deep in the winter, and their supplies must be running low, but he feared they might ravage the countryside about La Roche-Derrière before they left. And if they did, Jeanette's farms would be left worthless. How much rent can you get from a burned farm? He asked her. I don't care, she snapped. I shall sell everything if I have to, everything. Except for her husband's armor and weapons. They were precious and would go to her son one day. Bellin sighed for her foolishness, then huddled in his black cloak and leaned close to the small fire which spat in the hearth. A cold wind came from the nearby sea, making the chimney smoke. You will permit me, madame, to offer you advice? First, the business. Bellin paused to wipe his nose on his long black sleeve. It ails, but I can find you a good man to run it as your father did, and I would draw up a contract which would ensure the man would pay you well from the profits. Second, madame, you should think of marriage. He paused, half expecting a protest, but Jeanette said nothing. Bellin sighed. She was so lovely. There were a dozen men in town who would marry her, but marriage to an aristocrat had turned her head, and she would settle for nothing less than another titled man. "You are, madame," the lawyer continued carefully, "a widow who possesses at the moment a considerable fortune. But I have seen such fortunes drain away like snow in April. Find a man who can look after you, your possessions, and your son." Jeanette turned and stared at him. "I married the finest man in Christendom," she said, "and where do you think I will find another like him?" Men like the Count of Armorica, the lawyer thought, were found everywhere, more was the pity, for what were they but brute fools in armour who believed war was a sport? Jeanette, he thought, should marry a prudent merchant, perhaps a widower, who had a fortune, but he suspected such advice would be wasted. "Remember the old saying, my lady," he said slyly, "put a cat to watch a flock, and the wolves eat well." Jeanette shuddered with anger at the words. "You go beyond yourself, Monsieur Bellard." She spoke icily, then dismissed him, and the next day the English came to La Roche-Derrien, and Jeanette took her dead husband's crossbow from the place where she hid her wealth, and she joined the defenders on the walls. Damn Bellard's advice. She would fight like a man, and Duke Charles, who despised her, would learn to admire her, to support her, and restore her dead husband's estates to her son. So Jeanette had become the blackbird, and the English had died in front of her walls, and Bellard's advice was forgotten. And now, Jeanette reckoned, the town's defenders had so rattled the English that the siege would surely be lifted. All would be well, in which belief, for the first time in a week, the blackbird slept well. Thomas crouched beside the river. He had broken through a stand of alders to reach the bank, where he now pulled off his boots and hose. Best to go bare-legged, he reckoned, so the boots did not get stuck in the river mud. It was going to be cold, freezing cold, but he could not remember a time when he had been happier. He liked this life, and his memories of Hookton, Oxford, and his father had almost faded. "Take your boots off," he told the 20 archers who would accompany him, "and hang your arrow bags round your necks." "Why?" someone challenged him from the dark. "So it bloody throttles you," Thomas growled. "So your arrows don't get wet," another man explained helpfully. Thomas tied his own bag round his neck. Archers did not carry the quivers that hunters used, for quivers were open at the top and their arrows could fall out when a man ran or stumbled or clambered through a hedge. Arrows in quivers got wet when it rained, and wet feathers made arrows fly crooked, so real archers used linen bags that were waterproofed with wax and sealed by laces. The bags were bolstered by withy frames that spread the linen so the feathers were not crushed. Will Skeet edged down the bank where a dozen men were stacking the hurdles. He shivered in the cold wind that came from the water. The sky to the east was still dark, but some light came from the watchfires that burned within La Roche-Derrien. "They're nice and quiet in there," Skeet said, nodding towards the town. "Pray they're sleeping," Thomas said. "In beds, too. I've forgotten what a bed's like," Skeet said, then edged aside to let another man through to the river bank. Thomas was surprised to see it was Sir Simon Jekyll, who had been so scornful of him in the Earl's tent. "Sir Simon," Will Skeet said, barely bothering to disguise his own scorn, "wants a word with thee." Sir Simon wrinkled his nose at the stench of the river mud. Much of it, he supposed, was the town's sewage, and he was glad he was not wading bare-legged through the muck. "You are confident of passing the stakes?" he asked Thomas. "I wouldn't be going otherwise," Thomas said, not bothering to sound respectful. Thomas's tone made Sir Simon bridle, but he controlled his temper. "The Earl," he said distantly, "has given me the honour of leading the attack on the walls." He stopped abruptly, and Thomas waited, expecting more, but Sir Simon merely looked at him with an irritated face. "So Thomas takes the walls," Skeet finally spoke, "to make it safe for your ladders." "What I do not want," Sir Simon ignored Skeet and spoke to Thomas, "is for you to take your men ahead of mine into the town itself. We see armed men, we're likely to kill them, you understand?" Thomas almost spat in derision. His men would be armed with bows, and no enemy carried a long-stave bow like the English, so there was hardly any chance of being mistaken for the town's defenders. But he held his tongue. He just nodded. "You and your archers can join our attack," Sir Simon went on, "but you will be under my command." Thomas nodded again, and Sir Simon, irritated by the implied insolence, turned on his heel and walked away. "Goddamn bastard," Thomas said. "He just wants to get his nose into the trough ahead of the rest of us," Skeet said. "You're letting the bastard use our ladders?" Thomas asked. "If he wants to be first up, let him. Ladders are green wood, Tom, and if they break, I'd rather it was him tumbling than me. Besides, I reckon we'll be better off following you through the river, but I ain't telling Sir Simon that." Skeet grinned, then swore as a crash sounded from the darkness south of the river. "Those bloody white rats," Skeet said, and vanished into the shadows. The White Rats were the Bretons loyal to Duke John, men who wore his badge of a white ermine, and some 60 Breton crossbowmen had been attached to Skeet's soldiers, their job to rattle the walls with their bolts as the ladders were placed against the ramparts. It was those men who had startled the night with their noise, and now the noise grew even louder. Some fool had tripped in the dark and thumped a crossbowman with a pavis, the huge shield behind which the crossbows were laboriously reloaded, and the crossbowmen struck back, and suddenly the White Rats were having a brawl in the dark. The defenders naturally heard them and started to hurl burning bales of straw over the ramparts, and then a church bell began to toll, then another, and all this long before Thomas had even started across the mud. Sir Simon Jekyll, alarmed by the bells and the burning straw, shouted that the attack must go in now. "Carry the ladders forward," he bellowed. Defenders were running onto La Roche-Derrien's walls, and the first crossbow bolts were spitting off the ramparts that were lit bright by the burning bales. "Hold those goddamn ladders!" Will Skeet snarled at his men, then looked at Thomas. "What do you reckon?" "I think the bastards are distracted," Thomas said. "So you'll go?" "Got nothing better to do, Will." "Bloody white rats." Thomas led his men onto the mud. The hurdles were some help, but not as much as he had hoped, so that they still slipped and struggled their way towards the great stakes, and Thomas reckoned the noise they made was enough to wake King Arthur and his knights. But the defenders were making even more noise. Every church bell was clanging, a trumpet was screaming, men were shouting, dogs barking, cockerels were crowing, and the crossbows were creaking and banging as their cords were inched back and released. The walls loomed to Thomas's right. He wondered if the Blackbird was up there. He had seen her twice now and been captivated by the fierceness of her face and her wild black hair. A score of other archers had seen her too, and all of them men who could thread an arrow through a bracelet at 100 paces. Yet the woman still lived. Amazing, Thomas thought, what a pretty face could do. He threw down the last hurdle and so reached the wooden stakes, each one a whole tree trunk sunk into the mud. His men joined him, and they heaved against the timber until the rotted wood split like straw. The stakes made a terrible noise as they fell, but it was drowned by the uproar in the town. Jake, the cross-eyed murderer from Exeter jail, pulled himself alongside Thomas. To their right now was a wooden quay with a rough ladder at one end. Dawn was coming, and a feeble, thin, grey light was seeping from the east to outline the bridge across the Jeudi. It was a handsome stone bridge with a barbican at its further end, and Thomas feared the garrison of that tower might see them, but no one called an alarm, and no crossbow bolts thumped across the river. Thomas and Jake were first up the quay ladder, then came Sam, the youngest of Skeet's archers. The wooden landing stage served a timber yard, and a dog began barking frantically among the stacked trunks, but Sam slipped into the blackness with his knife, and the barking suddenly stopped. "Good doggy," Sam said as he came back. "String your bows," Thomas said. He had looped the hemp cord onto his own black weapon, and now untied the laces of his arrow bag. "I hate bloody dogs," Sam said. "One bit my mother when she was pregnant with me." "That's why you're daft," Jake said. "Shut your goddamn faces," Thomas ordered. More archers were climbing the quay, which was swaying alarmingly, but he could see that the walls he was supposed to capture were thick with defenders now. English arrows, their white goose feathers bright in the flame light of the defenders' fires, flickered over the wall and thumped into the town's thatched roofs. "Maybe we should open the south gate," Thomas suggested. "Go through the town?" Jake asked in alarm. "It's a small town," Thomas said. "You're mad," Jake said, but he was grinning, and he meant the words as a compliment. "I'm going anyway," Thomas said. It would be dark in the streets, and their long bows would be hidden. He reckoned it would be safe enough. A dozen men followed Thomas, while the rest started plundering the nearer buildings. More and more men were coming through the broken stakes now, as Will Skeet sent them down the riverbank, rather than wait for the wall to be captured. The defenders had seen the men in the mud and were shooting down from the end of the town wall, but the first attackers were already loose in the streets. Thomas blundered through the town. It was pitch black in the alleys and hard to tell where he was going, though by climbing the hill on which the town was built, he reckoned he must eventually go over the summit and so down to the southern gate. Men ran past him, but no one could see that he and his companions were English. The church bells were deafening. Children were crying, dogs howling, gulls screaming, and the noise was making Thomas terrified. This was a daft idea, he thought. Maybe Sir Simon had already climbed the walls. Maybe he was wasting his time. Yet white-feathered arrows still thumped into the town roofs, suggesting the walls were untaken, and so he forced himself to keep going. Twice he found himself in a blind alley, and the second time, doubling back into a wider street, he almost ran into a priest who had come from his church to fix a flaming torch in a wall bracket. "Go to the ramparts," the priest said sternly, then saw the longbows in the men's hands and opened his mouth to shout the alarm. He never had time to shout, for Thomas's bow-stave slammed point first into his belly. He bent over, gasping, and Jake casually slit his throat. The priest gurgled as he sank to the cobbles, and Jake frowned when the noise stopped. "I'll go to hell for that," he said. "You're going to hell anyway," Sam said. "We all are." "We're all going to heaven," Thomas said, "but not if we dawdle." He suddenly felt much less frightened, as though the priest's death had taken his fear. An arrow struck the church tower and dropped into the alley as Thomas led his men past the church and found himself on La Roche-Derrien's main street, which dropped down to where a watchfire burned by the southern gate. Thomas shrank back into the alley beside the church, for the street was thick with men, but they were all running to the threatened side of the town. And when Thomas next looked, the hill was empty. He could only see 2 sentinels on the ramparts above the gate arch. He told his men about the 2 sentries. "They're going to be scared as hell," he said. "We kill the bastards and open the gate." "But there might be others," Sam said. "There'll be a guardhouse." "Then kill them too," Thomas said. "Now come on." They stepped into the street, ran down a few yards, and there drew their bows. The arrows flew, and the 2 guards on the arch fell. A man stepped out of the guardhouse, built into the gate turret, and gawped at the archers, but before any could draw their bows, he stepped back inside and barred the door. "It's ours!" Thomas shouted, and led his men in a wild rush to the arch. The guardhouse stayed locked, so there was no one to stop the archers from lifting the bar and pushing open the 2 great gates. The Earl's men saw the gates open, saw the English archers outlined against the watchfire, and gave a great roar from the darkness that told Thomas a torrent of vengeful troops was coming towards him, which meant La Roche-Derrien's time of weeping could begin, for the English had taken the town. Jeanette woke to a church bell, ringing as though it was the world's doom, when the dead were rising from their graves and the gates of hell were yawning wide for sinners. Her first instinct was to cross to her son's bed, but little Charles was safe. She could just see his eyes in the dark that were scarcely alleviated by the glowing embers of the fire. "Mama?" he cried, reaching up to her. "Quiet!" She hushed the boy, then ran to throw open the shutters. A faint grey light showed above the eastern roofs. Then steps sounded in the street, and she leaned from the window to see men running from their houses with swords, crossbows, and spears. A trumpet was calling from the town centre. Then more church bells began tolling the alarm into a dying night. The bell of the Church of the Virgin was cracked and made a harsh, anvil-like noise that was all the more terrifying. "Madame!" a servant cried as she ran into the room. "The English must be attacking." Jeanette forced herself to speak calmly. She was wearing nothing but a linen shift and was suddenly cold. She snatched up a cloak, tied it about her neck, then took her son into her arms. "You will be all right, Charles," she tried to console him. "The English are attacking again, that is all." Except she was not sure. The bells were sounding so wild. It was not the measured tolling that was the usual signal of attack, but a panicked clangor, as though the men hauling the ropes were trying to repel an attack by their own efforts. She looked from the window again and saw the English arrows flitting across the roofs. She could hear them thumping into the thatch. The children of the town thought it was a fine sport to retrieve the enemy arrows, and two had injured themselves sliding from the roofs. Jeanette thought about getting dressed, but decided she must find out what was happening first, so she gave Charles to the servant, then ran downstairs. One of the kitchen servants met her at the back door. "What's happening, madame?" "Another attack, that is all." She unbarred the door to the yard, then ran to the private entrance to Renan's church, just as an arrow struck the church tower and clattered down into the yard. She pulled open the tower door, then groped up the steep ladders that her father had built. It had not been mere piety that had inspired Louis Halévy to construct the tower, but also the opportunity to look downriver to see if his boats were approaching, and the high stone parapet offered one of the best views in La Roche-Derrien. Jeanette was deafened by the church bell that swung in the gloom, each clapper stroke thumping her ears like a physical blow. She climbed past the bell, pushed open the trap-door at the top of the ladders, and clambered onto the leads. The English had come. She could see a torrent of men flowing about the river edge of the wall. They waded through the mud and swarmed over the broken stakes like a torrent of rats. Sweet Mother of Christ, she thought, sweet Mother of Christ, but they were in the town. She hurried down the ladders. "They're here," she called to the priest who hauled the bell rope. "They're in the town." "Havoc! Havoc!" the English shouted, the call that encouraged them to plunder. Jeanette ran across the yard and up the stairs. She pulled her clothes from the cupboard, then turned when the voices shouted havoc beneath her window. She forgot her clothes and took Charles back into her arms. "Mother of God," she prayed, "look after us now, look after us. Sweet Mother of God, keep us safe." She wept, not knowing what to do. Charles cried because she was holding him too tight, and she tried to soothe him. Cheers sounded in the street, and she ran back to the window and saw what looked like a dark river studded with steel flowing towards the town centre. She collapsed by the window, sobbing. Charles was screaming. Two more servants were in the room, somehow thinking that Jeanette could shelter them, but there was no shelter now. The English had come. One of the servants shot the bolt on the bedroom door. But what good would that do? Jeanette thought of her husband's hidden weapons and of the Spanish sword's sharp edge, and wondered if she would have the courage to place the point against her breast and heave her body onto the blade. It would be better to die than be dishonored, she thought. But then what would happen to her son? She wept helplessly, then heard someone beating on the big gate which led to her courtyard. An axe, she supposed, and she listened to its crunching blows that seemed to shake the whole house. A woman screamed in the town, then another, and the English voices cheered rampantly. One by one, the church bells fell silent, until only the cracked bell hammered its fear across the roofs. The axe still bit at the door. Would they recognize her, she wondered. She had exulted in standing on the ramparts, shooting her husband's crossbow at the besiegers, and her right shoulder was bruised because of it. But she had welcomed the pain, believing that every bolt fired made it less likely that the English would break into the town. No one had thought they could. And why besiege La Roche-Derrien anyway? It had nothing to offer. As a port, it was almost useless, for the largest ships could not make it up the river, even at the top of the tide. The English, the townspeople had believed, were making a petulant demonstration and would soon give up and slink away. But now they were here, and Jeanette screamed as the sound of the axe blows changed. They had broken through, and doubtless were trying to lift the bar. She closed her eyes, shaking as she heard the gate scrape on the cobbles. It was open. It was open. "Oh, Mother of God," she prayed, "be with us now." The scream sounded downstairs. Feet thumped on the stairs. Men's voices shouted in a strange tongue. "Be with us now and at the hour of our death, for the English had come." Sir Simon Jekyll was annoyed. He had been prepared to climb the ladders if Skeet's archers ever gained the walls, which he doubted, but if the ramparts were captured, then he intended to be first into the town. He foresaw cutting down a few panicked defenders, then finding some great house to plunder. But nothing happened as he had imagined it. The town was awake, the wall manned, and the ladders never went forward, but Skeet's men still got inside by simply wading through the mud at the river's edge. Then a cheer at the southern side of the town suggested that gate was open, which meant that the whole damned army was getting into La Roche-Derrien ahead of Sir Simon. He swore there would be nothing left. "My lord," one of his men-at-arms prompted Sir Simon, wanting a decision as to how they were to reach the women and valuables beyond the walls, which were emptying of their defenders as men ran to protect their homes and families. It would have been quicker, far quicker, to have waded through the mud, but Sir Simon did not want to dirty his new boots, and so he ordered the ladders forward. The ladders were made of green wood, and the rungs bent alarmingly as Sir Simon climbed, but there were no defenders to oppose him, and the ladder held. He clambered into an embrasure and drew his sword. A half-dozen defenders lay spitted with arrows on the rampart. 2 were still alive, and Sir Simon stabbed the nearest one. The man had been roused from his bed and had no mail, not even a leather coat, yet still the old sword made hard work of the killing stroke. It was not designed for stabbing, but for cutting. The new swords, made from the finest southern European steel, were renowned for their ability to pierce mail and leather, but this ancient blade required all Sir Simon's brute force to penetrate a rib cage. And what chance, he wondered sourly, would there be of finding a better weapon in this sorry excuse for a town? There was a flight of stone steps down into a street that was thronged by English archers and men-at-arms, smeared with mud to their thighs. They were breaking into houses. One man was carrying a dead goose, another had a bolt of cloth. The plundering had begun, and Sir Simon was still on the ramparts. He shouted at his men to hurry, and when enough of them had gathered on the wall's top, he led them down into the street. An archer was rolling a barrel from a cellar door. Another dragged a girl by an arm. Where to go? That was Sir Simon's problem. The nearest houses were all being sacked, and the cheers from the south suggested the Earl's main army was descending on that part of the town. Some townsfolk, realizing all was lost, were fleeing in front of the archers to cross the bridge and countryside. Sir Simon decided to strike east. The Earl's men were to the south, Skeets were staying close to the west wall, so the eastern quarter offered the best hope of plunder. He pushed past Skeets' muddy archers and led his men towards the bridge. Frightened people ran past him, ignoring him and hoping he would ignore them. He crossed the main street, which led, and saw a roadway running alongside the big houses that fronted the river. Merchants, Sir Simon thought, fat merchants with fat profits. And then, in the growing light, he saw an archway that was surmounted by a coat of arms. A noble's house. "Who has an axe?" he asked his men. One of the men-at-arms stepped forward, and Sir Simon indicated the heavy gate. The house had windows on the ground floor, but they were covered by heavy iron bars, which seemed a good sign. Sir Simon stepped back to let his man start work on the gate. The axeman knew his business. He chopped a hole where he guessed the locking bar was, and when he had broken through, he put a hand inside and pushed the bar up and out of its brackets so that Sir Simon and his archer could heave the gates open. Sir Simon left 2 men to guard the gate, ordering them to keep every other plunderer out of the property, then led the rest into the yard. The first things he saw were 2 boats tied at the river's quay. They were not large ships, but all hulls were valuable, and he ordered 4 of his archers to go aboard. "Tell anyone who comes that they're mine, you understand? Mine." He had a choice now, storerooms or house. And a stable? He told 2 men-at-arms to find the stable and stand guard on whatever horses were there. Then he kicked in the house door and led his 6 remaining men into the kitchen. 2 women screamed. He ignored them. They were old, ugly servants, and he was after richer things. A door led from the back of the kitchen, and he pointed one of his archers towards it. Then, holding his sword ahead of him, he went through a small dark hall into a front room. A tapestry showing Bacchus, the god of wine, hung on one wall, and Sir Simon had an idea that valuables were sometimes hidden behind such wall coverings, so he hacked at it with his blade, then hauled it down from its hooks, but there was only a plaster wall behind. He kicked the chairs, then saw a chest that had a huge dark padlock. "Get it open," he ordered 2 of his archers, "and whatever's inside is mine." Then, ignoring 2 books, which were of no use to man or beast, he went back into the hall and ran up a flight of dark wooden stairs. Sir Simon found a door leading to a room at the front of the house. It was bolted, and a woman screamed from the other side when he tried to force the door. He stood back and used the heel of his boot, smashing the bolt on the far side and slamming the door back on its hinges. Then he stalked inside, his old sword glittering in the dawn's wan light, and he saw a black-haired woman. Sir Simon considered himself a practical man. His father, quite sensibly, had not wanted his son to waste time on education, though Sir Simon had learned to read and could, at a pinch, write a letter. He liked useful things, hounds and weapons, horses and armour, and he despised the fashionable cult of gentility. His mother was a great one for troubadours, and was forever listening to songs of knights so gentle that Sir Simon reckoned they would not have lasted 2 minutes in a tourney's melee. The songs and poems celebrated love, as though it was some rare thing that gave a life enchantment. But Sir Simon did not need poets to define love, which to him was tumbling a peasant girl in a harvest field, or thrusting at some ale-reeking whore in a tavern. But when he saw the black-haired woman, he suddenly understood what the troubadours had been celebrating. It did not matter that the woman was shaking with fear, or that her hair was wildly awry, or that her face was streaked with tears. Sir Simon recognized beauty, and it struck him like an arrow. It took his breath away. So this, then, was love. It was the realization that he could never be happy until this woman was his. And that was convenient, for she was an enemy, the town was being sacked, and Sir Simon, clad in mail and fury, had found her first. "Get out," he snarled at the servants in the room. "Get out." The servants fled in tears, and Sir Simon booted the broken door shut, then advanced on the woman, who crouched beside her son's bed with the boy in her arms. "Who are you?" Sir Simon asked in French. The woman tried to sound brave. "I am the Countess of Armorica," she said. "And you, monsieur?" Sir Simon was tempted to award himself a peerage to impress Jeanette, but he was too slow-witted, and so heard himself uttering his proper name. He was slowly becoming aware that the room betrayed wealth. The bed hangings were thickly embroidered, the candlesticks were of heavy silver, and the walls either side of the stone hearth were expensively panelled in beautifully carved wood. He pushed the smaller bed against the door, reckoning that should ensure some privacy, then went to warm himself at the fire. He tipped more sea coal onto the small flames and held his chilled gloves close to the heat. "This is your house, madame?" "It is." "Not your husband's?" "I am a widow," Jeanette said. A wealthy widow. Sir Simon almost crossed himself out of gratitude. The widows he had met in England had been rouged hags, but this one was different. This one was a woman worthy of a tournament's champion, and seemed rich enough to save him from the ignominy of losing his estate and knightly rank. She might even have enough cash to buy a baronage, maybe an earldom. He turned from the fire and smiled at her. "Are those your boats at the quay?" "Yes, monsieur." "By the rules of war, madame, they are now mine. Everything here is mine." Jeanette frowned at that. "What rules?" "The law of the sword, madame. But I think you are fortunate. I shall offer you my protection." Jeanette sat on the edge of her curtained bed, clutching Charles. "The rules of chivalry, my lord," she said, "ensure my protection." She flinched as a woman screamed in a nearby house. "Chivalry?" Sir Simon asked. "Chivalry? I have heard it mentioned in songs, madame, but this is a war. Our task is to punish the followers of Charles of Blois for rebelling against their lawful lord. Punishment and chivalry do not mix." He frowned at her. "You're the Blackbird," he said, suddenly recognizing her in the light of the revived fire. "The Blackbird?" Jeanette did not understand. "You fought us from the walls. You scratched my arm." Sir Simon did not sound angry, but astonished. He had expected to be furious when he met the Blackbird, but her reality was too overpowering for rage. He grinned. "You closed your eyes when you shot the crossbow. That's why you missed." "I did not miss," Jeanette said indignantly. "A scratch," Sir Simon said, showing her the rent in his mail sleeve. "But why, madame, do you fight for the false duke?" My husband, she said stiffly, was nephew to Duke Charles. Sweet God, Sir Simon thought, sweet God, a prize indeed. He bowed to her. So your son, he said, nodding at Charles, who was peering anxiously from his mother's arms, is the present Count? He is, Jeanette confirmed. A fine boy. Sir Simon forced himself to the flattery. In truth, he thought Charles was a pudding-faced nuisance whose presence inhibited him from a natural urge to thrust the blackbird onto her back and thus show her the realities of war. But he was acutely aware that this widow was an aristocrat, a beauty, and related to Charles of Blois, who was nephew to the King of France. This woman meant riches, and Sir Simon's present necessity was to make her see that her best interest lay in sharing his ambitions. A fine boy, madame, he went on, who needs a father. Jeanette just stared at him. Sir Simon had a blunt face. It was bulbous-nosed, firm-chinned, and showed not the slightest sign of intelligence or wit. He had confidence, though, enough to have persuaded himself that she would marry him. Did he really mean that? She gaped, then gave a startled cry as angry shouting erupted beneath her window. Some archers were trying to get past the men guarding the gate. Sir Simon pushed open the window. "This place is mine," he snarled in English. "Go find your own chickens to pluck." He turned back to Jeanette. "You see, madame, how I protect you? So there is chivalry in war? There is opportunity in war, madame. You are wealthy. You are a widow. You need a man." She gazed at him with disturbingly large eyes, hardly daring to believe his temerity. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why?" Sir Simon was astonished by the question. He gestured at the window. "Listen to the screams, woman. What do you think happens to women when a town falls?" "But you said you would protect me," she pointed out. "So I will." He was getting lost in this conversation. The woman, he thought, though beautiful, was remarkably stupid. "I will protect you," he said, "and you will look after me." "How?" Sir Simon sighed. "You have money?" Jeanette shrugged. "There's a little downstairs, my lord, hidden in the kitchen." Sir Simon frowned angrily. Did she think he was a fool, that he would take that bait and go downstairs, leaving her to climb out of the window? "I know one thing about money, madame," he said, "and that is that you never hide it where the servants can find it. You hide it in the private rooms, in a bedchamber." He pulled open a chest and emptied its linens onto the floor, but there was nothing hidden there. And then, on an inspiration, he began rapping the wooden panelling. He had heard that such panels often concealed a hiding place, and he was rewarded almost instantly by a satisfyingly hollow sound. "No, monsieur," Jeanette said. Sir Simon ignored her, drawing his sword and hacking at the limewood panels that splintered and pulled away from their beams. He sheathed the blade and tugged with his gloved hands at the shattered wood. "No," Jeanette wailed. Sir Simon stared. Money was concealed behind the panelling, a whole barrel of coins. But that was not the prize. The prize was a suit of armor and a set of weapons, such as Sir Simon had only ever dreamed of. A shining suit of plate armor, each piece chased with subtle engravings and inlaid with gold. Italian work? And the sword. When he drew it from the scabbard, it was like holding Excalibur itself. There was a blue sheen to the blade, which was not nearly as heavy as his own sword, but felt miraculously balanced. A blade from the famous swordsmiths of Poitiers, perhaps, or even better, Spanish. "They belong to my husband," Jeanette appealed to him, "and it is all I have of his. They must go to Charles." Sir Simon ignored her. He traced his gloved finger down the gold inlay on the breastplate. That piece alone was worth an estate. "They are all he has of his father's," Jeanette pleaded. Sir Simon unbuckled his sword belt and let the old weapon drop to the floor, then fastened the Count of Armorica's sword about his waist. He turned and stared at Jeanette, marveling at her smooth, unscarred face. These were the spoils of war that he had dreamed about and had begun to fear would never come his way. A barrel of cash, a suit of armor fit for a king, a blade made for a champion, and a woman that would be the envy of England. "The armor is mine," he said, "as is the sword." "No, monsieur, please." "What will you do? Buy them from me?" "If I must," Jeanette said, nodding at the barrel. "That, too, is mine, madame," Simon said, and to prove it he strode to the door, unblocked it, and shouted for 2 of his archers to come up the stairs. He gestured at the barrel and the suit of armor. "Take them down," he said, "and keep them safe. And don't think I haven't counted the cash, because I have. Now go." Jeanette watched the theft. She wanted to weep for pity, but forced herself to stay calm. "If you steal everything I own," she said to Sir Simon, "how can I buy the armor back?" Sir Simon shoved the boy's bed against the door again, then favored her with a smile. "There is something you can use to buy the armor, my dear," he said winningly. "You have what all women have. You can use that." Jeanette closed her eyes for a few heartbeats. "Are all the gentlemen of England like you?" she asked. "Few are so skilled in arms," Sir Simon said proudly. He was about to tell her of his tournament triumphs, sure that she would be impressed, but she interrupted him. "I meant," she said icily, "to discover whether the knights of England are all thieves, poltroons, and bullies." Sir Simon was genuinely puzzled by the insult. The woman simply did not seem to appreciate her good fortune, a failing he could only ascribe to innate stupidity. "You forget, madame," he explained, "that the winners of war get the prizes. I am your prize." She was worse than stupid, Sir Simon thought, but who wanted cleverness in a woman? "Madame," he said, "I am your protector. If I leave you, if I take away my protection, then there will be a line of men on the stairs waiting to plough you. Now do you understand?" "I think," she said coldly, "that the Earl of Northampton will offer me better protection." Sweet Christ, Sir Simon thought, but the bitch was obtuse. It was pointless trying to reason with her, for she was too dull to understand. So he must force the breach. He crossed the room fast, snatched Charles from her arms, and threw the boy onto the smaller bed. Jeanette cried out and tried to hit him, but Sir Simon caught her arm and slapped her face with his gloved hand, and when she went immobile with pain and astonishment, he tore her cloak's cords apart and then, with his big hands, ripped the shift down the front of her body. She screamed and tried to clutch her hands over her nakedness, but Sir Simon forced her arms apart and stared in astonishment. Flawless. "No," Jeanette wept. Sir Simon shoved her hard back onto the bed. "You want your son to inherit your traitorous husband's armor?" he asked, "or his sword? Then, madame, you had better be kind to their new owner. I am prepared to be kind to you." He unbuckled the sword, dropped it on the floor, then hitched up his mail coat and fumbled with the strings of his hose. "No!" Jeanette wailed and tried to scramble off the bed, but Sir Simon caught hold of her shift and yanked the linen so that it came down to her waist. The boy was screaming, and Sir Simon was fumbling with his rusted gauntlets, and Jeanette felt the devil had come into her house. She tried to cover her nakedness, but the Englishman slapped her face again, and once more hauled up his mail coat. Outside the window, the cracked bell of the Virgin's Church was at last silent, for the English had come. Jeanette had a suitor, and the town wept. Thomas's first thought, after opening the gate, was not plunder, but somewhere to wash the river muck off his legs, which he did with a barrel of ale in the first tavern he encountered. The tavern keeper was a big, bold man who stupidly attacked the English archers with a club, so Jake tripped him with his bowstave, then slit his belly. "Silly bastard," Jake said. "I wasn't going to hurt him. Much." The dead man's boots fitted Thomas, which was a welcome surprise, for very few did, and once they had found his cache of coins, they went in search of other amusement. The Earl of Northampton was spurring his horse up and down the main street, shouting at wild-eyed men not to set the town alight. He wanted to keep La Roche-Derrien as a fortress, and it was less useful to him as a heap of ashes. End of Side 4. Side 5. Not everyone plundered. Some of the older men, even a few of the younger, were disgusted by the whole business and attempted to curb the wilder excesses, but they were wildly outnumbered by men who saw nothing but opportunity in the fallen town. Father Hobb, an English priest who had a fondness for Will Skeet's men, tried to persuade Thomas and his group to guard a church, but they had other pleasures in mind. "Don't spoil your soul, Tom," Father Hobb said, in a reminder that Thomas, like all the men, had said Mass the day before. But Thomas reckoned his soul was going to be spoiled anyway, so it might as well happen sooner than later. He was looking for a girl, any girl really, for most of Will's men had a woman in camp. Thomas had been living with the sweet little Breton, but she had caught a fever just before the beginning of the winter campaign, and Father Hobb had said a funeral mass for her. Thomas had watched as the girl's unshrouded body had thumped into the shallow grave, and he had thought of the graves at Hookton and of the promise he had made to his dying father. But then he had pushed the promise away. He was young and had no appetite for burdens on his conscience. La Roche-Derrien now crouched under the English fury. Men tore down thatch and wrecked furniture in their search for money. Any townsman who tried to protect his women was killed, while any woman who tried to protect herself was beaten into submission. Some folk had escaped the sack by crossing the bridge, but the small garrison of the Barbican fled from the inevitable attack, and now the Earl's men-at-arms manned the small tower, and that meant La Roche-Derrien was sealed to its fate. Some women took refuge in the churches, and the lucky ones found protectors there, but most were not lucky. Thomas, Jake, and Sam finally discovered an unplundered house that belonged to a tanner, a stinking fellow with an ugly wife and 3 small children. Sam, whose innocent face made strangers trust him on sight, held his knife at the throat of the youngest child, and the tanner suddenly remembered where he had hidden his cash. Thomas had watched Sam, fearing he really would slit the boy's throat, for Sam, despite his ruddy cheeks and cheerful eyes, was as evil as any man in Will Skeet's band. Jake was not much better, though Thomas counted both as friends. "The man's as poor as we are," Jake said in wonderment as he raked through the tanner's coins. He pushed a third of the pile towards Thomas. "You want his wife?" Jake offered generously. "Christ, no. She's cross-eyed like you. Is she?" Thomas left Jake and Sam to their games and went to find a tavern where there would be food, drink, and warmth. He reckoned any girl worth pursuing had been caught already, so he unstrung his bow, pushed past a group of men tearing the contents from a parked wagon, and found an inn where a motherly widow had sensibly protected both her property and her daughters by welcoming the first men-at-arms, showering them with free food and ale, then scolding them for dirtying her floor with their muddy feet. She was shouting at them now, though few understood what she said, and one of the men growled at Thomas that she and her daughters were to be left alone. Thomas held up his hands to show he meant no harm, then took a plate of bread, eggs, and cheese. "Now pay her," one of the men-at-arms growled, and Thomas dutifully put the tanner's few coins on the counter. "He's a good-looking one," the widow said to her daughters, who giggled. Thomas turned and pretended to inspect the daughters. "They are the most beautiful girls in Brittany," he said to the widow in French, "because they take after you, madame." That compliment, though patently untrue, raised squeals of laughter. Beyond the tavern were screams and tears, but inside it was warm and friendly. Thomas ate the food hungrily, then tried to hide himself in a window bay when Father Hobb came bustling in from the street. The priest saw Thomas anyway. "I'm still looking for men to guard the churches, Thomas." "I'm going to get drunk, Father," Thomas said happily, "so goddamn drunk that one of those 2 girls will look attractive." He jerked his head at the widow's daughters. Father Hobb inspected them critically, then sighed. "You'll kill yourself if you drink that much, Thomas." He sat at the table, waved at the girls, and pointed at Thomas's pot. "I'll have a drink with you," the priest said. "What about the churches?" "Everyone will be drunk soon enough," Father Hobb said, "and the horror will end. It always does. Ale and wine, God knows, are great causes of sin, but they make it short-lived. God's bones, but it's cold out there. He smiled at Thomas. "So how's your black soul, Tom?" Thomas contemplated the priest. He liked Father Hobb, who was small and wiry, with a mass of untamed black hair about a cheerful face that was thick-scarred from a childhood pox. He was low-born, the son of a Sussex wheelwright, and like any country lad, he could draw a bow with the best of them. He sometimes accompanied Skeet's men on their forays into Duke Charles's country, and he willingly joined the archers when they dismounted to form a battle line. Church law forbade a priest from wielding an edged weapon, but Father Hobb always claimed he used blunt arrows, though they seemed to pierce enemy mail as efficiently as any other. Father Hobb, in short, was a good man whose only fault was an excessive interest in Thomas's soul. "My soul," Thomas said, "is soluble in ale." "Now there's a good word," Father Hobb said. "Soluble, eh?" He picked up the big black bow and prodded the silver badge with a dirty finger. "You've discovered anything about that?" "No." "Or who stole the lance?" "No." "Do you not care any more?" Thomas leaned back in the chair and stretched his long legs. "I'm doing a good job of work, Father. We're winning this war, and this time next year, who knows? We might be giving the King of France a bloody nose." Father Hobb nodded agreement, though his face suggested Thomas's words were irrelevant. He traced his finger through a puddle of ale on the tabletop. "You made a promise to your father, Thomas, and you made it in a church. Isn't that what you told me? A solemn promise, Thomas, that you would retrieve the lance. God listens to such vows." Thomas smiled. "Outside this tavern, Father, there's so much rape and murder and theft going on that all the quills in heaven can't keep up with the list of sins. And you worry about me?" "Yes, Thomas, I do. Some souls are better than others. I must look after them all, but if you have a prize ram in the flock, then you do well to guard it." Thomas sighed. "One day, Father, I'll find the man who stole that goddamn lance, and I'll ram it up his arse until it tickles the hollow of his skull. One day. Will that do?" Father Hobb smiled beatifically. "It'll do, Thomas. But for now, there's a small church that could do with an extra man by the door. It's full of women. Some of them are so beautiful that your heart will break just to gaze at them. You can get drunk afterwards." "Are the women really beautiful?" "What do you think, Thomas? Most of them look like bats and smell like goats, but they still need protection." So Thomas helped guard a church, and afterwards, when the army was so drunk it could do no more damage, he went back to the widow's tavern, where he drank himself into oblivion. He had taken a town, he had served his lord well, and he was content. Thomas was woken by a kick. A pause, then a second kick, and a cup of cold water in his face. "Jesus!" "That's me," Will Skeet said. "Father Hobb told me you'd be here." "Oh, Jesus!" Thomas said again. His head was sore, his belly sour, and he felt sick. He blinked feebly at the daylight, then frowned at Skeet. "It's you. It must be grand to be so clever," Skeet said. He grinned at Thomas, who was naked in the straw of the tavern stables that he was sharing with one of the widow's daughters. "You must have been drunk as a lord to sheathe your sword in that," Skeet added, looking at the girl, who was pulling a blanket over herself. "I was drunk," Thomas groaned. "Still am." He staggered to his feet and put on his shirt. "The Earl wants to see you," Skeet said with amusement. "Me?" Thomas looked alarmed. "Why?" "Perhaps he wants you to marry his daughter," Skeet said. "Christ bones, Tom, but look at the state of you." Thomas pulled on his boots and mail coat, then retrieved his hose from the baggage camp and donned a cloth jacket over his mail. The jacket bore the Earl of Northampton's badge of 3 green and red stars, being pounced on by a trio of lions. He splashed water on his face, then scraped at his stubble with a sharp knife. "Grow a beard, lad," Skeet said. "It saves trouble." "Why does Billy want to see me?" Thomas asked, using the Earl's nickname. "After what happened in the town yesterday," Skeet suggested thoughtfully. "He reckons he's got to hang someone as an example. So he asked me if I had any useless bastards I wanted to be rid of, and I thought of you." "The way I feel," Thomas said, "he might as well hang me." He retched dryly, then gulped down some water. He and Will Skeet went back into the town to find the Earl of Northampton sitting in state. The building where his banner hung was supposed to be a guildhall, though it was probably smaller than the guardroom in the Earl's own castle. But the Earl was sitting at one end as a succession of petitioners pleaded for justice. They were complaining about being robbed, which was pointless considering they had refused to surrender the town, but the Earl listened politely enough. Then a lawyer, a weasel-snouted fellow called Bernard, bowed to the Earl and declaimed a long moan about the treatment offered to the Countess of Armorica. Thomas had been letting the word slide past him, but the insistence in Bernard's voice made him take notice. "If your lordship," Bernard said, smirking at the Earl, "had not intervened, then the Countess would have been raped by Sir Simon Chico." Sir Simon stood to one side of the hall. "That is a lie," he protested in French. The Earl sighed. "So why were your breeches round your ankles when I came into the house?" Sir Simon reddened as the men in the hall laughed. Thomas had to translate for Will Skeet, who nodded, for he had already heard the tale. "The bastard was about to lodge some titled widow," he explained to Thomas, "when the Earl came in. Had a scream, see? And he'd seen a coat of arms on the house. The aristocracy look after each other." The lawyer now laid a long list of charges against Sir Simon. It seemed he was claiming the widow and her son as prisoners who must be held for ransom. He had also stolen the widow's 2 ships, her husband's armor, his sword, and all the Countess's money. Bernard made the complaints indignantly, then bowed to the Earl. "You have a reputation as a just man, my lord," he said obsequiously, "and I place the widow's fate in your hands." The Earl of Northampton looked surprised to be told his reputation for fairness. "What is it you want?" he asked. Bernard preened. "The return of the stolen items, my lord, and the protection of the King of England for a widow and her noble son." The Earl drummed his fingers on the arm of the chair, then frowned at Sir Simon. "You can't ransom a 3-year-old, he said. "He's a count," Sir Simon protested, "a boy of rank." The Earl sighed. Sir Simon, he had come to realize, had a mind as simple as a bullock seeking food. He could see no point of view but his own, and was single-minded about pursuing his appetites. That, perhaps, was why he was such a formidable soldier, but he was still a fool. "We do not hold 3-year-old children to ransom," the Earl said firmly, "and we don't hold women as prisoners, not unless there is an advantage which outweighs the courtesy, and I see no advantage here." The Earl turned to the clerks behind his chair. "Who did Armorica support?" "Charles of Blois, my lord," one of the clerks, a tall Breton cleric, answered. "Is it a rich fief?" "Very small, my lord," the clerk, whose nose was running, spoke from memory. "There is a holding in Finisterre, which is already in our hands. Some houses in Gangon, I believe, but nothing else." "There," the Earl said, turning back to Sir Simon. "What advantages will we make from a penniless 3-year-old?" "Not penniless," Sir Simon protested. "I took a rich armor there." "Which the boy's father doubtless took in battle. And the house is wealthy." Sir Simon was getting angry. "There are ships, storehouses, stables." "The house," the clerk sounded bored, "belonged to the Count's father-in-law, a dealer in wine, I believe." The Earl raised a quizzical eyebrow at Sir Simon, who was shaking his head at the clerk's obstinacy. "The boy, my lord," Sir Simon responded with an elaborate courtesy which bordered on insolence, "is kin to Charles of Blois." "But being penniless," the Earl said, "I doubt he provokes fondness. More of a burden, wouldn't you think? Besides, what would you have me do? Make the child give fealty to the real Duke of Brittany? The real Duke, Sir Simon, is a 5-year-old child in London. It'll be a nursery farce. A 3-year-old bobbing down to a 5-year-old. Do their wet nurses attend them? Shall we feast on milk and penny cakes after? Or maybe we can enjoy a game of Hunt the Slipper when the ceremony is over." "The Countess fought us from the walls," Sir Simon attempted a last protest. "Do not dispute me," the Earl shouted, thumping the arm of his chair. "You forget that I am the King's deputy and have his powers." The Earl leaned back, taut with anger, and Sir Simon swallowed his own fury, but could not resist muttering that the Countess had used a crossbow against the English. "Is she the Blackbird?" Thomas asked Skeet. The Countess? Aye, that's what they say. She's a beauty. After what I found you prodding this morning, Skeet said, how can you tell? The Earl gave an irritated glance at Skeet and Thomas, then looked back to Sir Simon. If the Countess did fight us from the walls, he said, then I admire her spirit. As for the other matters... He paused and sighed. Bellard looked expectant, and Sir Simon wary. The 2 ships, the Earl decreed, are prizes, and they will be sold in England or else taken into royal service, and you, Sir Simon, will be awarded 1/3 of their value. That ruling was according to the law. The king would take 1/3, the Earl another, and the last portion went to the man who had captured the prize. As to the sword and armour, the Earl paused again. He had rescued Jeanette from rape, and he had liked her, and he had seen the anguish on her face, and listened to her impassioned plea that she owned nothing that had belonged to her husband except the precious armour and the beautiful sword. But such things, by their very nature, were the legitimate plunder of war. The armour and weapons and horses are yours, Sir Simon, the Earl said, regretting the judgment, but knowing it was fair. As to the child, I decree he is under the protection of the Crown of England, and when he is of age, he can decide his own fealty. He glanced at the clerks to make sure they were noting down his decisions. You tell me you wish to billet yourself in the widow's house? He asked Sir Simon. I took it, Sir Simon said curtly, and stripped it bare, I hear, the Earl observed icily. The Countess claims you stole money from her. She lies. Sir Simon looked indignant. Lies, my lord, lies. The Earl doubted it, but he could hardly accuse a gentleman of perjury without provoking a duel, and, though William Boone feared no man except his king, he did not want to fight over so petty a matter. He let it drop. However, he went on, I did promise the lady protection against harassment. He stared at Sir Simon as he spoke, then looked at Will Skeet and changed to English. You'd like to keep your men together, Will? I would, my lord. Then you'll have the widow's house, and she is to be treated honourably, you hear me? Honourably. Tell your men that, Will. Skeet nodded. I'll cut their ears off if they touch her, my lord. Not their ears, Will. Slice something more suitable away. Sir Simon will show you the house. And you, Sir Simon, the Earl spoke French again, will find a bed elsewhere. Sir Simon opened his mouth to protest, but one look from the Earl quietened him. Another petitioner came forward, wanting redress for a cellar full of wine that had been stolen, but the Earl diverted him to a clerk who would record the man's complaints on a parchment which the Earl doubted he would ever find time to read. Then he beckoned to Thomas. I have to thank you, Thomas of Hookton. Thank me, my lord. The Earl smiled. You found a way into the town when everything else we'd tried had failed. Thomas reddened. It was a pleasure, my lord. You can claim a reward of me, the Earl said. It's customary. Thomas shrugged. I'm happy, my lord. Then you're a lucky man, Thomas. But I shall remember the debt. And thank you, Will. Will Skeet grinned. If this lump of a daft fool don't want a reward, my lord, I'll take it. The Earl liked that. My reward to you, Will, is to leave you here. I'm giving you a whole new stretch of countryside to lay waste. God's teeth, you'll soon be richer than me. He stood. Sir Simon will guide you to your quarters. Sir Simon might have bridled at the curt order to be a mere guide, but surprisingly he obeyed without showing any resentment, perhaps because he wanted another chance to meet Jeanette. And so, at midday, he led Will Skeet and his men through the streets to the big house beside the river. Sir Simon had put on his new armour and wore it without any surcoat, so that the polished plate and gold embossment shone bright in the feeble winter sun. He ducked his helmeted head under the yard's archway, and immediately Jeanette came running from the kitchen door, which lay just to the gate's left. "Get out!" she shouted in French. "Get out!" Thomas, riding close behind Sir Simon, stared at her. She was indeed the Blackbird, and she was as beautiful at close range as she had been when he had glimpsed her on the walls. "Get out, all of you!" She stood, hands on her hips, bareheaded, shouting. Sir Simon pushed up the pig-snout visor of the helmet. "This house is commandeered, my lady," he said happily. "The Earl ordered it." "The Earl promised I would be left alone," Jeanette protested hotly. "Then his lordship has changed his mind," Sir Simon said. She spat at him. "You have already stolen everything else of mine. Now you would take the house too?" "Yes, madame," Sir Simon said, and he spurred the horse forward so that it crowded her. "Yes, madame," he said again, then wrenched the reins so that the horse twisted and thumped into Jeanette, throwing her onto the ground. "I'll take your house," Sir Simon said, "and anything else I want, madame." The watching archers cheered at the sight of Jeanette's long, bare legs. She snatched her skirts down and tried to stand, but Sir Simon edged his horse forward to force her into an undignified scramble across the yard. "Let the lass up!" Will Skeet shouted angrily. "She and I are old friends, Master Skeet," Sir Simon answered, still threatening Jeanette with the horse's heavy hoofs. "I said let her up and leave her be," Will snarled. Sir Simon, offended at being ordered by a commoner and in front of archers, turned angrily. But there was a competence about Will Skeet that gave the knight pause. Skeet was twice Sir Simon's age, and all those years had been spent in fighting, and Sir Simon retained just enough sense not to make a confrontation. "The house is yours, Master Skeet," he said condescendingly. "But look after its mistress. I have plans for her." He backed the horse from Jeanette, who was in tears of shame, then spurred out of the yard. Jeanette did not understand English, but she recognized that Will Skeet had intervened on her behalf, and so she stood and appealed to him. "He has stolen everything from me," she said, pointing at the retreating horseman. "Everything." "You know what the lass is saying, Tom?" Skeet asked. "She doesn't like Sir Simon," Thomas said laconically. He was leaning on his saddle pommel, watching Jeanette. "Calm the girl down, for Christ's sake," Skeet pleaded, then turned in his saddle. "Jake, make sure there's water and hay for horses. Peter, kill 2 of them heifers so we can sup before the light goes. Rest of you, stop gawping at the lass and get yourself settled." "Thief!" Jeanette called after Sir Simon, then turned on Thomas. "Who are you?" "My name is Thomas, madame." He slid out of the saddle and threw his reins to Sam. "The Earl has ordered us to live here," Thomas went on, "and to protect you." "Protect me?" Jeanette blazed at him. "You're all thieves. How can you protect me? There is a place in hell for thieves like you, and it is just like England. You are thieves, every one of you. Now go, go." "We're not going," Thomas said flatly. "How can you stay here?" Jeanette demanded. "I am a widow. It is not proper to have you here." "We're here, madame," Thomas said, "and you and us will have to make the best of it. We'll not encroach. Just show me where your private rooms are, and I'll make sure no man trespasses." "You? Make sure? Ha!" Jeanette turned away, but then immediately turned back. "You want me to show you my rooms, yes? So you know where my valuable properties are? Is that it? You want me to show you where you can thieve from me? Why don't I just give you everything?" Thomas smiled. "I thought you said Sir Simon had already stolen everything." "He has taken everything. Everything. He is no gentleman. He is a pig. He is—" Jeanette paused, wanting to contrive a crushing insult. "He is English." Jeanette spat at Thomas's feet and pulled open the kitchen door. "You see this door, Englishman? Everything beyond this door is private. Everything." She went inside, slammed the door, then immediately opened it again. "And the Duke is coming. The proper Duke, not your snivelling puppet child, so you will all die. Good." The door slammed again. Will Skeet chuckled. "She don't like you either, Tom. What was the last saying?" "They were all going to die." "Aye, that's true enough. But in our beds, by God's grace. And she says we're not to go past that door." "Plenty of room out here," Skeet said placidly, watching as one of his men swung an axe to kill a heifer. The blood flowed over the yard, attracting a rush of dogs to lap at it, while 2 archers began butchering the still twitching animal. "Listen!" Skeet had climbed a mounting block beside the stables and now shouted at all his men. "The Earl has given orders that the lass who was spitting at Tom is not to be molested. You understand that, you horsens? You keep your breeches laced up when she's around, and if you don't, I'll geld you. You treat her proper, and you don't go through that door. You've had your frolic, so now you can knuckle down to a proper bit of soldiering. The Earl of Northampton left after a week, taking most of his army back to the fortresses in Finisterre, which was the heartland of Duke John's supporters. He left Richard Toucham as commander of the new garrison, but he also left Sir Simon Jekyll as Toucham's deputy. The Earl doesn't want the bastard, Will Skeet told Thomas, so he's foisted him on us. As Skeet and Toucham were both independent captains, there could have been jealousy between them, but the two men respected each other, and while Toucham and his men stayed in La Roche-Derrien and strengthened its defences, Skeet rode out into the country to punish the folk who paid their rents and owed their allegiance to Duke Charles. The Aelcar were thus released to be a curse on northern Brittany. It was a simple business to ruin a land. The houses and barns might be made of stone, but their roofs would burn. The livestock was captured, and if there were too many beasts to herd home, then the animals were slaughtered and their carcasses tipped down wells to poison the water. Skeet's men burned what would burn, broke what would break, and stole what could be sold. They killed, raped, and plundered. Fear of them drove men away from their farms, leaving the land desolate. They were the devil's horsemen, and they did King Edward's will by harrowing his enemy's land. They wrecked village after village, Kervec and Lanvelec, Saint-Laurent and Les Sept-Saints, Tonquedec and Berhep, and a score of other places whose names they never learned. It was Christmas time, and back home the Yule logs were being dragged across frost-hardened fields to high-beamed halls, where troubadours sang of Arthur and his knights, of chivalrous warriors who allied pity to strength. But in Brittany the Aelcar fought the real war. Soldiers were not paragons. They were scarred, vicious men who took delight in destruction. They hurled burning torches onto thatch and tore down what had taken generations to build. Places too small to have names died, and only the farms in the wide peninsula between the two rivers north of La Roche-Derrien were spared, because they were needed to feed the garrison. Some of the serfs who were torn from their land were put to work heightening La Roche-Derrien's walls, clearing a wider killing ground in front of the ramparts, and making new barriers at the river's edge. It was a winter of utter misery for the Bretons. Cold rains whipped from the wild Atlantic, and the English scoured the farmlands. Once in a while there would be some resistance. A brave man would shoot a crossbow from a wood's edge, but Skeet's men were experts in trapping and killing such enemies. A dozen archers would dismount and stalk the enemy from the front, while a score of others galloped about his rear, and in a short while there would be a scream, and another crossbow was added to the plunder. The crossbow's owner would be stripped, mutilated, and hanged from a tree as a warning to other men to leave the Aelcar alone. And the lessons worked, for such ambushes became fewer. It was the wrecking time, and Skeet's men became rich. There were days of misery, days of slogging through cold rain with chapped hands and wet clothes, and Thomas always hated it when his men fetched the duty of leading the spare horses and then driving the captured livestock home. Geese were easy. Their necks were wrung and the dead birds hung from the saddles. But cows were slow, goats wayward, sheep stupid, and pigs obstinate. There were, however, enough farm-bred boys in the ranks to ensure that the animals reached La Roche-Derrien safely. Once there, they were taken to a small square that had become a slaughter yard and stank of blood. Will Skeet also sent cartloads of plunder back to the town, and most of that was shipped home to England. It was usually humble stuff: pots, knives, plough blades, harrow spikes, stools, pails, spindles, anything that could be sold, until it was said that there was not a house in southern England which did not possess at least one object plundered from Brittany. In England they sang of Arthur and Lancelot, of Gawain and Percival, but in Brittany the Aelcar were loose. And Thomas was a happy man. Jeanette was loath to admit it, but the presence of Will Skeet's men was an advantage to her. As long as they were in the courtyard, she felt safe in the house, and she began to dread the long periods they spent away from the town, for it was then that Sir Simon Jekyll would haunt her. She had begun to think of him as the devil, a stupid devil, to be sure, but still a remorseless, unfeeling lout who had convinced himself Jeanette must wish nothing so much as to be his wife. At times he would force himself to a clumsy courtesy, though usually he was bumptious and crude, and always he stared at her like a dog gazing at a haunch of beef. He took Mass in the church of Saint-Renan so he could woo her, and it seemed to Jeanette she could not walk in the town without meeting him. Once, encountering Jeanette in the alley beside the Church of the Virgin, he crowded her against the wall and slid his strong fingers up to her breasts. "I think, madame, you and I are suited," he told her in all earnestness. "You need a wife with money," she told him, for she had learned from others in the town the state of Sir Simon's finances. "I have your money," he pointed out, "and that has settled half my debts, and the prize money from the ships will pay much of the rest. But it is not your money I want, sweet one, but you." Jeanette tried to wrench away, but he had her trapped against the wall. "You need a protector, my dear," he said, and kissed her tenderly on the forehead. He had a curiously full mouth, big-lipped and always wet, as though his tongue was too large, and the kiss was wet and stank of stale wine. He pushed a hand down her belly, and she struggled harder, but he just pressed his body against hers and took hold of her hair beneath her cap. "You like Berkshire, my dear?" "I would rather live in hell." He fumbled at the laces of her bodice, and Jeanette vainly tried to push him away, but she was only saved when a troop of men rode into the alley, and their leader called a greeting to Sir Simon, who had to turn away to respond, and that allowed Jeanette to wrench herself free. She left her cap in his grasp as she ran home, where she barred the doors, then sat weeping and angry and helpless. She hated him. She hated all the English, yet as the weeks passed, she watched the townsfolk come to approve of their occupiers, who spent good money in La Roche-Derrien. English silver was dependable, unlike the French, which was debased with lead or tin. The presence of the English had cut the town off from its usual trade with Rennes and Guingamp, but the ship owners were now free to trade with both Gascony and England, and so their profits rose. Local ships were chartered to import arrows for the English troops, and some of the shipmasters brought back bales of English wool that they resold in other Breton ports that were still loyal to Duke Charles. Few folk were willing to travel far from La Roche-Derrien by land, for they needed to secure a pass from Richard Tocham, the commander of the garrison, and though the scrap of parchment protected them from the Elquin, it was no defense against the outlaws who lived in the farms emptied by Skeet's men. But boats from La Roche-Derrien and Tréguier could still sail east to Paimpol or west to Lannion, and so trade with England's enemies. That was how letters were sent out of La Roche-Derrien, and Jeanette wrote almost weekly to Duke Charles with news of the changes the English were making to the town's defenses. She never received a reply, but she persuaded herself that her letters were useful. La Roche-Derrien prospered, but Jeanette suffered. Her father's business still existed, but the profits mysteriously vanished. The larger ships had always sailed from the quays of Tréguier, which lay an hour downriver, and though Jeanette sent them to Gascony to fetch wine for the English market, they never returned. They had either been taken by French ships, or, more likely, their captains had gone into business for themselves. The family farms lay south of La Roche-Derrien, in the countryside laid waste by Will Skeet's men, and so those rents disappeared. Plabennec, her husband's estate, was in English-held Finistère, and Jeanette had not seen a penny from that land in 3 years. So by the early weeks of 1346, she was desperate, and thus summoned the lawyer Bélard to the house. Bélard took a perverse pleasure in telling her how she had ignored his advice, and how she should never have equipped the 2 boats for war. Jeanette suffered his pomposity, then asked him to draw up a petition of redress, which she could send to the English court. The petition begged for the rents of Plabennec, which the invaders had been taking for themselves. It irked Jeanette that she must plead for money from King Edward III of England, but what choice did she have? Sir Simon Jekyll had impoverished her. Bélard sat at her table and made notes on a scrap of parchment. "How many mills at Plabennec?" he asked. "There were 2. 2, he said, noting the figure. "You do know," he added cautiously, "that the Duke has made a claim for those rents?" "The Duke?" Jeanette asked in astonishment. For Plabennec. Duke Charles claims it is his fief, Bella said. It might be, but my son is the Count. The Duke considers himself the boy's guardian, Bella observed. How do you know these things? Jeanette asked. Bella shrugged. I have had correspondence from the Duke's men of business in Paris. What correspondence? Jeanette demanded sharply. About another matter, Bella said dismissively. Another matter entirely. Plabennec's rents were collected quarterly, I assume? Jeanette watched the lawyer suspiciously. Why would the Duke's men of business mention Plabennec to you? They asked if I knew the family. Naturally, I revealed nothing. He was lying, Jeanette thought. She owed Bella money. Indeed, she was in debt to half of La Roche-Derrien's tradesmen. Doubtless, Bella thought his bill was unlikely to be paid by her, and so he was looking to Duke Charles for eventual settlement. Monsieur Bella, she said coldly, you will tell me exactly what you have been telling the Duke and why. Bella shrugged. I have nothing to tell. How is your wife? Jeanette asked sweetly. Her aches are passing as winter ends, thank God. She is well, madame. Then she will not be well, Jeanette said tartly, when she learns what you do with your clerk's daughter. How old is she, Bella? 12? Madame. Don't madame me. Jeanette thumped the table, almost upsetting the flask of ink. So what has passed between you and the Duke's men of business? Bella sighed. He put the cap on the ink flask, laid down the quill, and rubbed his thin cheeks. I have always, he said, looked after the legal matters of this family. It is my duty, madame, and sometimes I must do things that I would rather not, but such things are also a part of my duty. He half smiled. You are in debt, madame. You could rescue your finances easily enough by marrying a man of substance, but you seem reluctant to follow that course, and so I see nothing but ruin in your future. Ruin? You wish some advice? Sell this house, and you will have money enough to live for 2 or 3 years, and in that time the Duke will surely drive the English from Brittany, and you and your son will be restored to Plabennec. Jeanette flinched. You think the devils will be defeated that easily? She heard hoofs in the street and saw that Skeet's men were returning to her courtyard. They were laughing as they rode. They did not look like men who would be defeated soon. Indeed, she feared they were unbeatable, for they had a blithe confidence that galled her. I think, madame, Bella said, that you must make up your mind what you are. Are you Louis Alevi's daughter or Henri Chenier's widow? Are you a merchant or an aristocrat? If you are a merchant, madame, then marry here and be content. If you are an aristocrat, then raise what money you can and go to the Duke and find yourself a new husband with a title. Jeanette considered the advice impertinent, but did not bridle. How much would we make on this house? She asked instead. I shall inquire, madame, Bella said. He knew the answer already, and knew that Jeanette would hate it, for a house in a town occupied by an enemy would fetch only a fraction of its proper value. So now was not the time to give Jeanette that news. Better, the lawyer thought, to wait until she was truly desperate. Then he could buy the house and its ruined farms for a pittance. Is there a bridge across the stream at Plabennec? He asked, drawing the parchment towards him. Forget the petition, Jeanette said. If you wish, madame. I shall think about your advice, Bella. You will not regret it, he said earnestly. She was lost, he thought, lost and defeated. He would take her house and farms, the Duke would claim Plabennec, and she would be left with nothing. Which was what she deserved, for she was a stubborn and proud creature who had risen far above her proper station. I am always, Bella said humbly, at your ladyship's service. From adversity, he thought, a clever man could always profit, and Jeanette was ripe for plucking. Put a cat to guard the sheep, and the wolves would eat well. Jeanette did not know what to do. She was loath to sell the house, for she feared it would fetch a low price, but nor did she know how else she could raise money. Would Duke Charles welcome her? He He had never shown any sign of it, not since he had opposed her marriage to his nephew. But perhaps he had softened since then. Perhaps he would protect her. She decided she would pray for guidance. So she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, crossed the yard, ignoring the newly returned soldiers, and went into Saint Renan's church. There was a statue of the Virgin there, sadly shorn of her gilded halo, which had been ripped away by the English, and Jeanette often prayed to the image of Christ's mother, whom she believed had a special care for all women in trouble. She thought at first that the dimly lit church was empty. Then she saw an English bow propped against a pillar and an archer kneeling at the altar. It was the good-looking man, the one who wore his hair in a long pigtail bound with bow cord. It was, she thought, an irritating sign of vanity. Most of the English wore their hair cropped, but a few grew it extravagantly long, and they were the ones who seemed most flamboyantly confident. She wished he would leave the church. Then she was intrigued by his abandoned bow, and so she picked it up and was astonished by its weight. The string hung loose, and she wondered how much strength would be needed to bend the bow and hook the string's free loop on the empty horn tip. She pressed one end of the bow on the stone floor, trying to bend it, and just then an arrow span across the flagstones to lodge against her foot. "If you can string the bow," Thomas said, still on his knees at the altar, "you can have a free shot." Jeanette was too proud to be seen to fail and too angry not to try, though she attempted to disguise her effort, which barely flexed the black ewe stay. She kicked the arrow away. "My husband was killed by one of these bows," she said bitterly. "I've often wondered," Thomas said, "why you Bretons or the French don't learn to shoot them. Start your son at 7 or 8 years, madame, and in 10 years he'll be lethal. He'll fight as a knight, like his father." Thomas laughed. "We kill knights. They haven't made an armor strong enough to resist an English arrow." Jeanette shuddered. "What are you praying for, Englishman?" she asked. "Forgiveness?" Thomas smiled. "I am giving thanks, madame, for the fact that we rode 6 days in enemy country and did not lose one man." He climbed from his knees and pointed to a pretty silver box that sat on the altar. It was a reliquary and had a small crystal window that was rimmed with drops of colored glass. Thomas had peered through the window and seen nothing more than a small black lump about the size of a man's thumb. "What is it?" he asked. "The tongue of Saint Renan," Jeanette said defiantly. "It was stolen when you came to our town, but God was good, and the thief died next day, and the relic was recovered." "God is indeed good," Thomas said dryly. "And who was Saint Renan?" "He was a great preacher," she said, "who banished the Nain and Goric from our farmlands. They still live in the wild place, but a prayer to Saint Renan will scare them away." "Nain and Goric?" Thomas asked. "They are spirits," she said. "They wanted the whole land, and I pray daily to the saint that he will banish the Harlequin as he drove out the Nain. You know what the Harlequin are?" "We are," Thomas said proudly. She grimaced at his tone. "The Harlequin," she said icily, "from in hell, and so he gives them his horses and releases them on the living." She hefted his black bow and pointed to the silver plate tacked to its belly. "You even have the devil's picture on your bow." "It's a Yale," Thomas said. "It is a devil," she insisted, and threw the bow at him. Thomas caught it and, because he was too young to resist showing off, casually strung it. He made it appear effortless. "You pray to Saint Renan," he said, "and I shall pray to Saint Guinefort. We shall see which saint is the stronger." "Guinefort? I've not heard of her." "Him," Thomas corrected her, "and he lived in the Lyonnais." "You pray to a French saint?" Jeanette asked, intrigued. "All the time," Thomas said, touching the desiccated dog's paw that hung about his neck. He did not tell Jeanette anything more about the saint, who had been a favorite of his father's, who in his better moments would laugh at the story. Guinefort had been a dog and, so far as Thomas's father knew, the only animal ever to be canonized. The beast had saved a baby from a wolf, then been martyred by his owner, who thought the dog had eaten the baby when in truth he had hidden it beneath the cot. "Pray to the blessed Guinefort," had been Father Ralph's reaction to every domestic crisis, and Thomas had adopted the saint as his own. He sometimes wondered whether the saint was an efficient intercessor in heaven, though perhaps Guinefort's whining and barking were as effective as the pleas of any other saint. But Thomas was sure that few other folk used the dog as their representative to God, and perhaps that meant he received special protection. Father Hobb had been shocked to hear of a holy dog, but Thomas, though he shared his father's amusement, now genuinely thought of the animal as his guardian. End of Side 5. Side 6. Jeanette wanted to know more about the blessed son, Guinefort, but she did not want to encourage an intimacy with any of Skeet's men, and so she forgot her curiosity and made her voice cold again. "I have been wanting to see you," she said, "to tell you that your men and their women must not use the yard as a latrine. I see them from the window. It is disgusting. Maybe you behave like that in England, but this is Brittany. You can use the river." Thomas nodded, but said nothing. Instead, he carried his bow down the nave, which had one of its long sides obscured by fishing nets hung up for mending. He went to the church's western end, which was gloomily decorated by a painting of the Doom. The righteous were vanishing into the rafters, while the condemned sinners were tumbling to a fiery hell, cheered on by angels and saints. Thomas stopped in front of the painting. "Have you ever noticed," he said, "how the prettiest women are always falling down to hell, and the ugly ones are going up to heaven?" Jeanette almost smiled, for she had often wondered about that same question. But she bit her tongue and said nothing, as Thomas walked back up the nave beside a painting of Christ walking on a sea that was grey and white-crested, like the ocean off Brittany. A shoal of mackerel were poking their heads from the water to watch the miracle. "What you must understand, madame," Thomas said, gazing up at the curious mackerel, "is that our men do not like being unwelcome. You won't even let them use the kitchen. Why not? It's big enough, and they'd be glad of a place to dry their boots after a wet night's riding. Why should I have you English in my kitchen? So you can use that as a latrine as well?" Thomas turned and looked at her. "You have no respect for us, madame, so why should we have respect for your house?" "Respect," she mocked the word. "How can I respect you? Everything that is precious to me was stolen by you." "By Sir Simon Jekyll," Thomas said. "You or Sir Simon?" Jeanette asked. "What is the difference?" Thomas picked up the arrow and dropped it into his bag. "The difference, madame, is that once in a while I talk to God, while Sir Simon thinks he is God. I shall ask the lads to piss in the river, but I doubt they'll want to please you much." He smiled at her, then was gone. Spring was greening the land, giving a haze to the trees and filling the twisting laneways with bright flowers. New green moss grew on thatch, there was white stitchwort in the hedgerows, and kingfishers whipped between the new yellow leaves of the riverside sallows. Skeet's men were having to go further from La Roche-Derrien to find new plunder, and their long rides took them dangerously close to Guingamp, which was Duke Charles's headquarters, though the town's garrison rarely came out to challenge the raiders. Guingamp lay to the south, while to the west was Lannion, a much smaller town with a far more belligerent garrison that was inspired by Sir Geoffrey de Pontblanc, a knight who had sworn an oath that he would lead Skeet's raiders back to Lannion in chains. He announced that the Englishmen would be burned in Lannion's marketplace because they were heretics, the devil's men. Will Skeet was not worried by such a threat. "I might lose a wink of sleep if the silly bastard had proper archers," he told Tom, "but he ain't, so he can blunder about as much as he likes. Is that his real name?" "Geoffrey of the White Bridge." "Daft bastard. Is he Breton or French?" "I'm told he's French." "Have to teach him a lesson then, won't we?" Sir Geoffrey proved an unwilling pupil. Will Skeet dragged his coat closer and closer to Lannion, burning houses within sight of its walls, in an effort to lure Sir Geoffrey out into an ambush of archers. But Sir Geoffrey had seen what English arrows could do to mounted knights, and so he refused to lead his men in a wild charge that would inevitably finish as a pile of screaming horses and bleeding men. He stalked Skeet instead, looking for some place where he could ambush the Englishmen, but Skeet was no more of a fool than Sir Geoffrey, and for 3 weeks the two war bands circled and skirted each other. Sir Geoffrey's presence slowed Skeet, but did not stop the destruction. The two forces clashed twice, and both times Sir Geoffrey threw his crossbowmen forward on foot, hoping they could finish off Skeet's archers, but both times the longer arrows won, and Sir Geoffrey drew off without forcing a fight he knew he must lose. After the second inconclusive clash, he even tried appealing to Will Skeet's honour. He rode forward all alone, dressed in an armour as beautiful as Sir Simon Jekyll's, though Sir Geoffrey's helmet was an old-fashioned pot with perforated eye-holes. His surcoat and his horse's trapper were dark blue, on which white bridges were embroidered, and the same device was blazoned on his shield. He carried a blue-painted lance, from which he had hung a white scarf to show he came in peace. Skeet rode forward to meet him, with Thomas as interpreter. Sir Geoffrey lifted off his helmet and pushed a hand through his sweat-flattened hair. He was a young fellow, golden-haired and blue-eyed, with a broad, good-humoured face, and Thomas felt he would probably have liked the man if he had not been an enemy. Sir Geoffrey smiled as the two Englishmen curbed their horses. "It is a dull thing," he said, "to shoot arrows at each other's shadows. I suggest you bring your men-at-arms into the field's centre and meet us there on equal terms." Thomas did not even bother to translate, for he knew what Skeet's answer would be. "I have a better idea," he said. "You bring your men-at-arms, and we'll bring our archers." Sir Geoffrey looked puzzled. "Do you command?" he asked Thomas. He had thought that the older and grizzled Skeet was the captain, but Skeet stayed silent. "He lost his tongue fighting the Scots," Thomas said, "so I speak for him." "Then tell him I want an honourable fight," Sir Geoffrey said spiritedly. "Let me pit my horsemen against yours." He smiled as if to suggest his suggestion was as reasonable as it was chivalrous as it was ridiculous. Thomas translated for Skeet, who twisted in his saddle and spat into the clover. "He says," Thomas said, "that our archers will meet your men. 12 of our archers against a score of your men-at-arms." Sir Geoffrey shook his head sadly. "You have no sense of sport, you English," he said, then put his leather-lined pot back on his head and rode away. Thomas told Skeet what had passed between them. "Silly goddamn bastard," Skeet said. "What did he want? A tournament? Who does he think we are, the Knights of the Round Bloody Table? I don't know what happens to some folk. They put a sir in front of their names and their brains get addled. Fighting fair? Who ever heard of anything so daft? Fight fair and you lose. Bloody fool." Sir Geoffrey of the White Bridge continued to haunt the Elcair, but Skeet gave him no chance for a fight. There was always a large band of archers watching the Frenchmen's forces, and whenever the men from Lannion became too bold, they were likely to have the goose-feathered arrows thumping into their horses. So Sir Geoffrey was reduced to a shadow, but he was an irritating and persistent shadow, following Skeet's men almost back to the gates of La Roche-Derrien. The trouble occurred the third time that he trailed Skeet, and so came close to the town. Sir Simon Jekyll had heard of Sir Geoffrey, and warned by a sentinel on the highest church tower that Skeet's men were in sight, he led out a score of the garrison's men-at-arms to meet the Elcair. Skeet was just over a mile from the town, and Sir Geoffrey, with 50 men-at-arms and as many mounted crossbowmen, was just another half-mile behind. The Frenchman had caused no great problems to Skeet, and if Sir Geoffrey wanted to ride home to Lannion and claim that he had chased the Elcair back to their lair, then Skeet was quite happy to give the Frenchman that satisfaction. Then Sir Simon came, and it was all suddenly display and arrogance. The English lances went up, the helmet visors clanged shut, and their horses were prancing. Sir Simon rode towards the French and Breton horsemen, bellowing a challenge. Will Skeet followed Sir Simon and advised him to let the bastards be, but the Yorkshireman was wasting his breath. Skeet's men-at-arms were at the front of the column, escorting the captured livestock and 3 wagons filled with plunder, while the rear guard was formed by 60 mounted archers. Those 60 men had just reached the big woods where the army had camped during the siege of La Roche-Derrien, and at a signal from Skeet they split into 2 groups and rode into the trees either side of the road. They dismounted in the woods, tied their horses' reins to branches, then carried their bows to the edge of the trees. The road ran between the 2 groups, edged by wide grassy verges. Sir Simon wheeled his horse to confront Will Skeet. "I want 30 of your men-at-arms, Skeet," he demanded peremptorily. "You can want them," Will Skeet said, "but you'll not have them." "Good Christ, man, I outrank you!" Sir Simon was incredulous at Skeet's refusal. "I outrank you, Skeet. I'm not asking you, fool, I'm ordering." Skeet looked up at the sky. "Looks like rain, don't you think? And we could do with a drop. Fields are right dry and streams are low." Sir Simon reached out and gripped Skeet's arm, forcing the older man to turn to him. "He has 50 knights," Sir Simon spoke of Sir Geoffrey de Pontblanc, "and I have 20. Give me 30 men and I'll take him prisoner. Just give me 20. He was pleading, all arrogance gone, for this was a chance for Sir Simon to fight a proper skirmish, horseman against horseman, and the winner would have renown and the prize of captured men and horses. But Will Skeet knew everything about men, horses, and renown. "I'm not out here to play games," he said, shaking his arm free. "And you can order me till the cows sprout wings, but you'll not have a man of mine." Sir Simon looked anguished, but then Sir Geoffrey de Pontblanc decided the matter. He saw how his men-at-arms outnumbered the English horsemen, and so he ordered 30 of his followers to ride back and join the crossbowmen. Now the two troops of horsemen were evenly matched, and Sir Geoffrey rode forward on his big black stallion that was swathed in its blue and white trapper and had a boiled leather mask for face armor, a chanfron. Sir Simon rode to meet him in his new armor, but his horse had no padded trapper and no chanfron, and he wanted both, just as he wanted this fight. All winter he had endured the misery of a peasant's war, all muck and murder, and now the enemy was offering honor, glory, and the chance to capture some fine horses, armor, and good weapons. The two men saluted each other by dipping their lances, then exchanged names and compliments. Will Skeet had joined Thomas in the woods. "You might be a woolly-headed fool, Tom," Skeet said, "but there's plenty more stupid than you. Look at the daft bastards, not a brain between either of them. You could shake them by the heels and nothing would drop out of their ears but dried muck." He spat. Sir Geoffrey and Sir Simon agreed on the rules of the fight. Tournament rules, really, only with death to give the sport spice. An unhorsed man was out of the fight, they agreed, and would be spared, though such a man could be taken prisoner. They wished each other well, then turned and rode back to their men. Skeet tied his horse to a tree and strung his bow. "There's a place in York," he said, "where you can watch the mad folk. They keep them caged up, and you pay a farthing to go and laugh at them. They should put those two silly bastards in with them." "My father was mad for a time," Thomas said. "Don't surprise me, lad. Don't surprise me at all," Skeet said. He looped his bow cord onto a stave that had been carved with crosses. His archers watched the men-at-arms from the edge of the woods. As a spectacle, it was wondrous, like a tournament. Only on this spring meadow there were no marshals to save a man's life. The two groups of horsemen readied themselves. Squires tightened girths, men hefted lances, and made sure their shield straps were tight. Visors clanged shut, turning the horsemen's world into a dark place slashed with slitted daylight. They dropped their reins, for from now on the well-trained destriers would be guided by the touch of spur and the pressure of knees. The horsemen needed both hands for their shields and weapons. Some men wore two swords, a heavy one for slashing and a thinner blade for stabbing, and they made certain the weapons slid easily from their scabbards. Some gave their lances to squires to leave a hand free to make the sign of the cross, then took the lances back. The horses stamped on the pasture. Then Sir Geoffrey lowered his lance in a signal that he was ready, and Sir Simon did the same, and the 40 men spurred their big horses forward. These were not the light-boned mares and geldings that the archers rode, but the heavy destriers, stallions all, and big enough to carry a man and his armor. The beasts snorted, tossed their heads, and lumbered into a trot as the riders lowered their long lances. One of Sir Geoffrey's men made the beginner's mistake of lowering the lance too much, so that the point stuck in the dry turf, and he was lucky not to be unhorsed. He left the lance behind and drew his sword. The horsemen spurred into the canter, and one of Sir Simon's men swerved to the left, probably because his horse was ill-trained, and it bumped the next horse, and the ripple of colliding horses went down the line as the spurs rowelled back to demand the gallop. Then they struck. The sound of the wooden lances striking shields and mail was a crunch like splintering bones. 2 horsemen were rammed back out of their high saddles, but most of the lance thrusts had been parried by shields, and now the horsemen dropped the shivered weapons as they galloped past their opponents. They sawed on the reins and drew their swords. but it was plain to the watching archers that the enemy had gained an advantage. Both of the unhorsed riders were English, and Sir Geoffrey's men were much more closely aligned, so that when they turned to bring their swords to the melee, they came as a disciplined group that struck Sir Simon's men in a clangor of sword against sword. An Englishman reeled from the melee with a missing hand. Dust and turf spewed up from hoofs. A riderless horse limped away. The swords clashed like hammers on anvils. Men grunted as they swung. A huge Breton, with no device on his plain shield, was wielding a falchion, a weapon that was half sword and half axe, and he used the broad blade with a terrible skill. An English man-at-arms had his helmet split open and his skull with it, so that he rode wavering from the fight, blood pouring down his mail coat. His horse stopped a few paces from the turmoil, and the man-at-arms slowly, so slowly, bent forward and then slumped down from the saddle. One foot was trapped in a stirrup as he died, but his horse did not seem to notice. It just went on cropping the grass. 2 of Sir Simon's men yielded and were sent back to be taken prisoner by the French and Breton squires. Sir Simon himself was fighting savagely, turning his horse to beat off 2 opponents. He sent one reeling out of the fight with a useless arm, then battered the other with swift cuts from his stolen sword. The French had 15 men still fighting, but the English were down to 10, when the great brute with the falchion decided to finish Sir Simon off. He roared as he charged, and Sir Simon caught the falchion on his shield and lunged his sword into the mail under the Breton's armpit. He yanked the sword free, and there was blood pouring from the rent in the enemy's mail and leather tunic. The big man twitched in the saddle, and Sir Simon hammered the sword onto the back of his head, then turned his horse to beat off another assailant, before wheeling back to drive his heavy weapon in a crushing blow against the big Breton's Adam's apple. The man dropped his falchion and clutched his throat as he rode away. "He's good, isn't he?" Skeet said flatly. "Got suet for brains, but he knows how to fight." But, despite Sir Simon's prowess, the enemy was winning, and Thomas wanted to advance the archers. They only needed to run about 30 paces, and then would have been in easy range of the rampaging enemy horsemen. But Will Skeet shook his head. "Never kill 2 Frenchmen when you can kill a dozen, Tom," he said reprovingly. "Our men are getting beat," Thomas protested. "Then that'll teach 'em not to be bloody fools, won't it?" Skeet said. He grinned. "Just wait, lad, just wait, and we'll skin the cat proper." The English men-at-arms were being beaten back, and only Sir Simon was fighting with spirit. He was indeed good. He had driven the huge Breton from the fight, and was now holding off 4 of the enemy, and doing it with a ferocious skill. But the rest of his men, seeing that their battle was lost, and that they could not reach Sir Simon because there were too many enemy horsemen around him, turned and fled. "Sam!" Will shouted across the road. "When I give you the word, take a dozen men and run away. You hear me, Sam?" "I'll run away," Sam shouted back. The English men-at-arms, some bleeding and one half falling from his tall saddle, thundered back down the road towards La Roche-Derrien. The French and Bretons had surrounded Sir Simon, but Sir Geoffrey of the White Bridge was a romantic fellow, and refused to take the life of a brave opponent, and so he ordered his men to spare the English knight. Sir Simon, sweating like a pig under the leather and iron plate, pushed up the snout-like visor of his helmet. "I don't yield," he told Sir Geoffrey. His new armor was scarred and his sword edge chipped, but the quality of both had helped him in the fight. "I don't yield," he said again, "so fight on." Sir Geoffrey bowed in his saddle. "I salute your bravery, Sir Simon," he said magnanimously, "and you are free to go with all honor." He waved his men-at-arms aside, and Sir Simon, miraculously alive and free, rode away with his head held high. He had led his men into disaster and death, but he had emerged with honor. Sir Geoffrey could see past Sir Simon, down the long road that was thick with fleeing men-at-arms, and beyond them the captured livestock and the heaped carts of plunder that were being escorted by Skeet's men. Then Will Skeet shouted at Sam, and suddenly Sir Geoffrey could see a bunch of panicked archers riding northwards as hard as they could. "He'll fall for it," Skeet said knowingly. "You just see if he don't." Sir Geoffrey had proved in the last weeks that he was no fool, but he lost his wits that day. He saw a chance to cut down the hated Harlequin archers and recapture 3 carts of plunder. and so he ordered his remaining 30 men-at-arms to join him, and, leaving his 4 prisoners and 9 captured horses in the care of his crossbowmen, waved his knights forward. Will Skeet had been waiting weeks for this. Sir Simon turned in alarm as he heard the sound of hooves. Nearly 50 armored men on big destriers charged towards him, and for a moment he thought they were trying to capture him, and so he spurred his horse towards the woods, only to see the French and Breton horsemen crash past him at full gallop. Sir Simon ducked under branches and swore at Will Skeet, who ignored him. He was watching the enemy. Sir Geoffrey de Pontblanc led the charge and saw only glory. He had forgotten the archers in the woods, or else believed they had all fled after the defeat of Sir Simon's men. Sir Geoffrey was on the cusp of a great victory. He would take back the plunder, and even better, lead the dreaded Harlequin to a fiery fate in Lagnon's marketplace. "Now!" Skeet shouted through cupped hands. "Now!" There were archers on both sides of the road, and they stepped out from the new spring foliage and loosed their bowstrings. Thomas's second arrow was in the air before the first even struck. Look and loose, he thought, do not think, and there was no need to aim, for the enemy was a tight group, and all the archers did was pour their long arrows into the horsemen, so that in an eye blink the charge was reduced to a tangle of rearing stallions, fallen men, screaming horses, and splashing blood. The enemy had no chance. A few at the back managed to turn and gallop away, but the majority were trapped in a closing ring of bowmen who drove their arrows mercilessly through mail and leather. Any man who even twitched invited 3 or 4 arrows. The pile of iron and flesh was spiked with feathers, and still the arrows came, cutting through mail and driving deep into horseflesh. Only the handful of men at the rear and a single man at the very front of the charge survived. That man was Sir Geoffrey himself. He had been 10 paces in front of his men, and maybe that was why he was spared, or perhaps the archers had been impressed by the manner in which he had treated Sir Simon. But for whatever reason, he rode ahead of the carnage like a charmed soul. Not an arrow flew close, but he heard the screams and clatter behind, and he slowed his horse, then turned to see the horror. He watched with disbelief for an instant, then walked his stallion back towards the arrow-stuck pile that had been his men. Skeet shouted at some of his bowmen to turn and face the enemy's crossbowmen, but they, seeing the fate of their men-at-arms, were in no mood to face the English arrows. They retreated southwards. There was a curious stillness then. Fallen horses twitched, and some beat at the road with their hooves. A man groaned, another called on Christ, and some just whimpered. Thomas, an arrow still on his bowstring, could hear larks, the call of plovers, and the whisper of wind in the leaves. A drop of rain fell, splashing the dust on the road, but it was a lone outrider of a shower that went to the west. Sir Geoffrey stood his horse beside his dead and dying men, as if inviting the archers to add his corpse to the heap that was streaked with blood and flecked with goose feathers. "See what I mean, Tom?" Skeet said. "Wait long enough and the bloody fools will always oblige you. Right, lads, finish the bastards off." Men dropped their bows, drew their knives, and ran to the shuddering heap, but Skeet held Thomas back. "Go and tell that stupid white bridge bastard to make himself scarce." Thomas walked to the Frenchman, who must have thought he was expected to surrender, for he pulled off his helmet and extended his sword handle. "My family cannot pay a great ransom," he said apologetically. "You're not a prisoner," Thomas said. Sir Geoffrey seemed perplexed by the words. "You release me?" "We don't want you," Thomas said. "You might think about going to Spain," he suggested, "or the Holy Land. Not too many Elka in either place." Sir Geoffrey sheathed his sword. "I must fight against the enemies of my king, so I shall fight here. But I thank you." He gathered his reins, and just at that moment Sir Simon Jekyll rode out of the trees, pointing his drawn sword at Sir Geoffrey. "He's my prisoner," he called to Thomas. "My prisoner!" "He's no one's prisoner," Thomas said. "We're letting him go." "You're letting him go?" Sir Simon sneered. "Do you know who commands here?" "What I know," Thomas said, "is that this man is no prisoner." He thumped the trapper-covered rump of Sir Geoffrey's horse to send it on its way. "Spain or the Holy Land?" he called after Sir Geoffrey. Sir Simon turned his horse to follow Sir Geoffrey, then saw that Will Skeet was ready to intervene and stop any such pursuit. So he turned back to Thomas. "You had no right to release him. No right." "He released you," Thomas said. "Then he was a fool, and because he is a fool, I must be." Sir Simon was quivering with anger. Sir Geoffrey might have declared himself a poor man, hardly able to raise a ransom, but his horse alone was worth at least £50, and Skeet and Thomas had just sent that money trotting southwards. Sir Simon watched him go, then lowered the sword blade so that it threatened Thomas's throat. "From the moment I first saw you," he said, "you have been insolent. I am the highest-born man on this field, and it is I who decides the fate of prisoners. You understand that?" "He yielded to me," Thomas said, "not to you, so it don't matter what bed you were born in." "You're a pup," Sir Simon spat. "Skeet, I want recompense for that prisoner, you hear me?" Skeet ignored Sir Simon, but Thomas did not have enough sense to do the same. "Jesus," he said in disgust, "that man spared you, and you'd not return the favour? You're not a bloody knight, you're just a bully. Go and boil your arse." The sword rose, and so did Thomas's bow. Sir Simon looked at the glittering arrow point, its edges feathered white through sharpening, and he had just enough wit not to strike with his sword. He sheathed it instead, slamming the blade into the scabbard, then wheeled his destrier and spurred away, which left Skeet's men to sort out the enemy's dead. There were 18 of them, and another 23 grievously wounded. There were also 16 bleeding horses and 24 dead, and that, as Will Skeet remarked, was a wicked waste of good horseflesh. And Sir Geoffrey had been taught his lesson. There was a fuss back in La Roche-Derrien. Sir Simon Jekyll complained to Richard Touchsome that Will Skeet had failed to support him in battle, then also claimed to have been responsible for the death or wounding of 41 enemy men-at-arms. He boasted he had won the skirmish, then returned to his theme of Skeet's perfidy, but Richard Touchsome was in no mood to endure Sir Simon's querulousness. "Did you win the fight or not?" "Of course we won!" Sir Simon blinked indignantly. "They're dead, ain't they?" "So why did you need Will's men-at-arms?" Touchsome asked. Sir Simon searched for an answer and found none. "He was impertinent," he complained. "That's for you and him to settle, not me," Touchsome said in abrupt dismissal. But he was thinking about the conversation, and that night he talked with Skeet. 41 dead or wounded, he muttered. "That must be a third of Lannion's men-at-arms." "Near as may be, aye." Touchsome's quarters were near the river, and from his window he could watch the water slide under the bridge arches. Bats flitted about the Barbican tower that guarded the bridge's further side, while the cottages beyond the river were lit by a sharp-edged moon. "They'll be short-handed, Will," Touchsome said. "They'll not be happy, that's for sure. And the place will be stuffed with valuables." "Like as not," Skeet agreed. Many folk, fearing the Elcair, had taken their belongings to the nearby fortresses, and Lannion must be filled with their goods. More to the point, Touchsome would find food there. His garrison received some food from the farms north of La Roche-Derrien, and more was brought across the Channel from England, but the Elcair's wastage of the countryside had brought harmlessly close. "Leave 50 men here?" Touchsome was still thinking aloud, but he had no need to explain his thoughts to an old soldier like Skeet. "We'll need new ladders," Skeet said. "What happened to the old ones?" "Firewood. It were a cold winter." "A night attack?" Touchsome suggested. "Full moon in 5 or 6 days." 5 days from now, then," Touchsome decided. "And I'll want your men, Will, if they're sober by then." "They deserve their drink after what they did today," Touchsome said warmly, then gave Skeet a smile. "Sir Simon was complaining about you. Says you were impertinent." "That weren't me, Dick. It was my lad Tom. Told the bastard to go and boil his arse." "I fear Sir Simon was never one for taking good advice," Touchsome said gravely. Nor were Skeet's men. He had let them loose in the town, but warned them that they would feel rotten in the morning if they drank too much, and they ignored that advice to make celebration in La Roche-Derrien's taverns. Thomas had gone with a score of his friends and their women to an inn where they sang, danced, and tried to pick a fight with a group of Duke John's white rats, who were too sensible to rise to the provocation, and slipped quietly into the night. A moment later, 2 men-at-arms walked in, both wearing jackets, with the Earl of Northampton's badge of the Lions and the Stars. Their arrival was jeered, but they endured it with patience, and asked if Thomas was present. "He's the ugly bastard over there," Jake said, pointing to Thomas, who was dancing to the music of a flute and drum. The men-at-arms waited till he had finished his dance, then explained that Will Skeet was with the garrison's commander and wanted to talk with him. Thomas drained his ale. "What it is," he told the other archers, "is that they can't make a decision without me. Indispensable, that's me." The archers mocked that, but cheered good-naturedly as Thomas left with the 2 men-at-arms. One of them came from Dorset, and had actually heard of Hookton. "Didn't the French land there?" he asked. "Bastards wrecked it. I doubt there's anything left," Thomas said. "So why does Will want me?" "God knows, and he ain't telling," one of the men said. He had led Thomas towards Richard Touchsom's headquarters, but now he pointed down a dark alley. "They're in a tavern at the end there, place with the anchor hanging over the door." "Good for them," Thomas said. If he had not been half-drunk, he might have realized that Touchsom and Skeet were unlikely to summon him to a tavern, let alone the smallest one in town, at the river end of the darkest alley. But Thomas suspected nothing until he was halfway down the narrow passage, and 2 men stepped from a gateway. The first he knew of them was when a blow landed on the back of his head. He pitched forward onto his knees, and the second man kicked him in the face. Then both men rained kicks and blows on him until he offered no more resistance, and they could seize his arms and drag him through the gate into a small smithy. There was blood in Thomas's mouth. His nose had been broken again, a rib was cracked, and his belly was churning with ale. A fire burned in the smithy. Thomas, through half-closed eyes, could see an anvil. Then more men surrounded him and gave him a second kicking, so that he rolled into a ball in a vain attempt to protect himself. "Enough," a voice said, and Thomas opened his eyes to see Sir Simon Jekyll. The 2 men who had fetched him from the tavern, and who had seemed so friendly, now came through the smithy gate and stripped off their borrowed tunics, showing the Earl of Northampton's badge. "Well done," Sir Simon told them, then looked at Thomas. "Mere archers," Sir Simon said. "Do not tell knights to boil their arse." A tall man, a huge brute with lank yellow hair and blackened teeth, was standing beside Thomas, wanting to kick him if he offered an insolent reply, so Thomas held his tongue. Instead, he offered a silent prayer to St. Sebastian, the patron saint of archers. This plight, he reckoned, was too serious to be left to a dog. "Take his breeches down, Collie," Sir Simon ordered, and turned back to the fire. Thomas saw there was a great 3-legged pot standing in the red-hot charcoal. He swore under his breath, realizing that he was the one who was to get a boiled arse. Sir Simon peered into the pot. "You are to be taught a lesson in courtesy," he told Thomas, who whimpered as the yellow-haired brute cut through his belt, then dragged his breeches down. The other men searched Thomas's pockets, taking what coins they found and a good knife. Then they turned him onto his belly, so that his naked arse was ready for the boiling water. Sir Simon saw the first wisps of steam float from the pot. "Take it to him," he ordered his men. 3 of Sir Simon's soldiers were holding Thomas down, and he was too hurt and too weak to fight them, so he did the only thing he could. He screamed murder. He filled his lungs and bellowed as loud as he could. He reckoned he was in a small town that was crowded with men, and someone must hear, and so he shrieked the alarm. "Murder! Murder!" A man kicked his belly, but Thomas went on shouting. "For Christ's sake, silence him!" Sir Simon snarled, and Collie, the yellow-haired man, kneeled beside Thomas and tried to stuff straw into his mouth, but Thomas managed to spit it out. "Murder!" he screamed. "Murder!" Collie swore, took a handful of filthy mud and slapped it into Thomas's mouth, muffling his noise. "Bastard," Collie said, and thumped Thomas's skull. "Bastard!" Thomas gagged on the mud, but he could not spit it out. Sir Simon was standing over him now. "You are to be taught good manners," he said, and watched as the steaming pot was carried across the smithy yard. Then the gate opened, and a newcomer stepped into the yard. "What in God's name is happening here?" the man asked, and Thomas could have sung a Te Deum in praise of St. Sebastian if his mouth had not been crammed with mud. For his rescuer was Father Hobb, who must have heard the frantic shouting and come running down the alley to investigate. "What are you doing?" the priest demanded of Sir Simon. "It is not your business, Father," Sir Simon said. "Thomas, is it you?" He turned back to the knight. "By God, it is my business." Father Hobb had a temper, and he lost it now. "Who the devil do you think you are?" "Be careful, priest," Sir Simon snarled. "Be careful? Me? I will have your soul in hell if you don't leave." The small priest snatched up the smith's huge poker and wielded it like a sword. "I'll have all your souls in hell. Leave! All of you! Out of here! Out! In the name of God! Get out! Get out!" Sir Simon backed down. It was one thing to torture an archer, but quite another to get into a fight with a priest, whose voice was loud enough to attract still more attention. Sir Simon snarled that Father Hobb was an interfering bastard, but he retreated all the same. Father Hobb knelt beside Thomas and hooked some of the mud from his mouth, along with tendrils of thick blood and a broken tooth. "You poor lad," Father Hobb said, then helped Thomas stand. "I'll take you home, Tom. Take you home and clean you up." Thomas had to vomit first, but then, holding his breeches up, he staggered back to Jeanette's house, supported all the way by the priest. A dozen archers greeted him, wanting to know what had happened, but Father Hobb brushed them aside. "Where's the kitchen?" he demanded. "She won't let us in there," Thomas said, his voice indistinct because of his swollen mouth and bleeding gums. "Where is it?" Father Hobb insisted. One of the archers nodded at the door, and the priest just pushed it open and half-carried Thomas inside. He sat him on a chair and pulled the rush lights to the table's edge so he could see Thomas's face. "Dear God," he said, "what have they done to you?" He patted Thomas's hand, then went to find water. Jeanette came into the kitchen, full of fury. "You are not supposed to be here. You will get out." Then she saw Thomas's face, and her voice trailed away. If someone had told her that she would see a badly beaten English archer, she would have been cheered. But to her surprise, she felt a pang of sympathy. "What happened?" "Sir Simon Jekyll did this," Thomas managed to say. "Sir Simon? He's an evil man." Father Hobb had heard the name and came from the scullery with a big bowl of water. "He's an evil thing, evil." He spoke in English. "You have some cloths?" he asked Jeanette. "She doesn't speak English," Thomas said. Blood was trickling down his face. "Sir Simon attacked you?" Jeanette asked. "Why?" "Because I told him to boil his arse," Thomas said, and was rewarded with a smile. "Good," Jeanette said. She did not invite Thomas to stay in the kitchen, but nor did she order him to leave. Instead, she stood and watched as the priest washed his face, then took off Thomas's shirt to bind up the cracked rib. "Tell her she could help me," Father Hobb said. "She's too proud to help," Thomas said. "It's a sinful, sad world," Father Hobb declared, then knelt down. "Hold still, Tom," he said, "for this will hurt like the very devil." He took hold of the broken nose, and there was the sound of cartilage scraping before Thomas shouted in pain. Father Hobb put a cold, wet cloth over his nose. "Hold that there, Tom, and the pain will go. Well, it won't really, but you'll get used to it." He sat on an empty salt barrel, shaking his head. "Sweet Jesus, Tom, what are we going to do with you?" "You've done it," Thomas said, "and I'm grateful. A day or two and I'll be leaping about like a spring lamb." "You've been doing that for too long, Tom," Father Hobb said earnestly. Jeanette, not understanding a word, just watched the two men. "God gave you a good head," the priest went on, "but you waste your wits, Tom. You do waste them." "You want me to be a priest?" Father Hobb smiled. "I doubt you'd be much credit to the church, Tom. You'd like us not end up as an archbishop because you're clever and devious enough, but I think you'd be happier as a soldier. But you have debts to God, Tom. Remember that promise you made to your father? You made it in a church, and it would be good for your soul to keep that promise, Tom." Thomas laughed and immediately wished he had not, for the pain whipped through his ribs. He swore, apologized to Jeanette, then looked back to the priest. "And how in the name of God, Father,"
am I supposed to keep that promise? I don't even know what bastard stole the lance.
What bastard? Jeanette asked, for she had picked up that one word. Sir Simon?
He is a bastard, Thomas said, but he's not the only one.
And he told her about the lance, about the day his village had been murdered, about his father dying, and about the man who carried a banner showing 3 yellow hawks on a blue field. He told the story slowly, through bloody lips, and when he had finished, Jeanette shrugged. So you want to kill this man, yes?
One day.
He deserves to be killed, Jeanette said. Thomas stared at her through half-closed eyes, astonished by those words.
You know him?
He is called Sir Guillaume de Vec, Jeanette said.
What's he saying?
Father Hobb asked. I know him, Jeanette said grimly. In Caen, where he comes from, he is sometimes called the Lord of the Sea and of the Land.
Because he fights on both?
Thomas guessed. He is a knight, Jeanette said, but he is also a sea raider, a pirate. My father owned 16 ships, and Guillaume de Vec stole 3 of them.
He fought against you?
Thomas sounded surprised. Jeanette shrugged. He thinks any ship that is not French is an enemy. We are Bretons. Thomas looked at Father Hobb.
There you are, Father, he said lightly. To keep my promise, all I must do is fight the Knight of the Sea and of the Land.
Father Hobb had not followed the French, but he shook his head sadly. How you keep the promise, Thomas, is your business. But God knows you made it, and I know you were doing nothing about it. He fingered the wooden cross he wore on a leather lace about his neck.
And what shall I do about Sir Simon?
Nothing, Thomas said. I must tell Totsum at least, the priest insisted.
Nothing, Father.
Thomas was just as insistent.
Promise me.
Father Hobb looked suspiciously at Thomas. You're not thinking of taking your own revenge, are you? Thomas crossed himself and hissed because of the pain in his rib.
Doesn't our Mother Church tell us to turn the other cheek? He asked.
It does, Father Hobb said dubiously, but it wouldn't condone what Sir Simon did tonight.
We shall turn away his wrath with a soft answer,
Thomas said, and Father Hobb, impressed by this display of genuine Christianity, nodded his acceptance of Thomas's decision. Jeanette had been following the conversation as best she could, and had at least gathered the gist of their words. Are you discussing what to do to Sir Simon? She asked Thomas.
I'm going to murder the bastard, Thomas said in French.
She offered him a sour grimace. That is a very clever idea, Englishman. So you will be a murderer, and they will hang you? Then, thanks be to God, there will be 2 dead Englishmen. What's she saying, Thomas? Father Hobb asked.
She's agreeing that I ought to forgive my enemies, Father.
Good woman, Father Hobb said. Do you really want to kill him? Jeanette demanded coldly. Thomas shuddered with the pain, but he was not so hurt that he could not appreciate Jeanette's closeness. She was a hard woman, he reckoned, but still as lovely as the spring, and, like the rest of Will Skeet's men, he had harbored impossible dreams of knowing her better. Her question gave him that chance.
I'll kill him, he assured her, and in killing him, my lady, I'll fetch you your husband's armor and sword.
Jeanette frowned at him. You can do that?
If you help me.
She grimaced. How? So Thomas told her, and to his astonishment she did not dismiss the idea in horror, but instead nodded a grudging acceptance. It might really work, she said after a while. It really might work. Which meant that Sir Simon had united his enemies, and Thomas had found himself an ally. Jeanette's life was encompassed by enemies. She had her son, but everyone else she loved was dead, and those who were left she hated. There were the English, of course, occupying her town, but there was also Bella, the lawyer, and the shipmasters who had cheated her, and the tenants who used the presence of the English to default on their rent, and the town's merchants who dunned her for money she did not have. She was a countess, yet her rank counted for nothing. At night, brooding on her plight, she would dream of meeting a great champion, a duke perhaps,
who would come to La Roche-Derrien and punish her enemies one by one. She saw them whimpering with terror, pleading for mercy, and receiving none. But in each dawn there was no duke, and her enemies did not cringe, and Jeanette's troubles were unrelieved, until Thomas promised to help her kill the one enemy she hated above the rest. To which end, early in the morning, after her conversation with Thomas, Jeanette went to Richard Touchsom's headquarters. She went early because she hoped Sir Simon Jekyll would still be in bed, and though it was essential he knew the purpose of her visit, she did not want to meet him. Let him learn from others what she planned.
End of Side 6. Side 7. The headquarters, like her own house, fronted the River Jeudi, and the waterfront yard, despite the early hour, already held a score of petitioners seeking favours from the English. Jeanette was told to wait with the other petitioners. "I am the Countess of Armorica," she told the clerk. "You must wait like the rest," the clerk answered in poor French, then cut another notch in a tally stick on which he was counting arrow sheaves that were being unloaded from a lighter that had come upriver from the deep-water harbour at Tréguier. A second lighter held barrels of red herrings, and the stench of the fish made Jeanette shudder. English food. They did not even gut the herrings before smoking them, and the red fish came from the barrels covered in yellow-green mould, yet the archers ate them with relish. She tried to escape the reeking fish by crossing the yard to where a dozen local men trimmed great lengths of timber propped on sawhorses. One of the carpenters was a man who had sometimes worked for Jeanette's father, though he was usually too drunk to hold a job for more than a few days. He was barefoot, ragged, humpbacked, and hare-lipped, though when he was sober, he was as good a labourer as any in the town. "Jacques," Jeanette called, "what are you doing?" She spoke in Breton. Jacques tugged his forelock and bobbed down. "You're looking well, my lady." Only a few folk could understand his speech, for his split lip mangled the sounds. "Your father always said you were his angel." "I asked what you are doing." "Ladders, my lady, ladders." Jacques cuffed a stream of mucus from his nose. There was a weeping ulcer on his neck, and the stink of it was as bad as the red herrings. "They want 6 ever so long ladders." "Why?" Jacques looked left and right to make sure no one could overhear him. "What he says," he jerked his head at the Englishman, who was supposedly supervising the work, "what he says is that they're taking them to Lannion, and they're long enough for that big wall, ain't they?" "Lannion?" "He likes his ale, he does," Jacques said, explaining the Englishman's indiscretion. "Hey, handsome!" the supervisor shouted at Jacques. "Get to work!" Jacques, with a grin to Jeanette, picked up his tools. "Make the rungs loose," Jeanette advised Jacques in Breton, then turned because her name had been called from the house. Sir Simon Jekyll, looking heavy-eyed and sleepy, was standing in the doorway, and Jeanette's heart sank at the sight of him. "My lady," Sir Simon offered Jeanette a bow, "you should not be waiting with the common folk." "Tell that to the clerk," Jeanette said coldly. The clerk, tallying the arrow sheaves, squealed when Sir Simon caught him by the ear. "This clerk?" he asked. "He told me to wait out here." Sir Simon cuffed the man across the face. "She's a lady, you bastard! You treat her like a lady!" He kicked the man away, then pulled the door fully open. "Come, my lady," he invited her. Jeanette went to the door and was relieved to see 4 more clerks busy at tables inside the house. "The army," Sir Simon said, as she brushed past him, "has almost as many clerks as archers. Clerks, farriers, masons, cooks, herdsmen, butchers, anything else on 2 legs that can take the king's coin." He smiled at her, then brushed a hand down his threadbare wool robe that was trimmed with fur. "If I had known you were gracing us with a visit, my lady, I would have dressed." Sir Simon, Jeanette noted gladly, was in a puppy mood this morning. He was always either boorish or clumsily polite, and she hated him in either mood, but at least he was easier to deal with when he tried to impress her with his manners. "I came," she told him, "to request a pass from Monsieur Touchsom." The clerks watched her surreptitiously, their quills scratching and spluttering on the scraped parchment. "I can give you a pass," Sir Simon said gallantly.
Though I trust you are not leaving La Roche-Derrien permanently.
I just wish to visit Louannec, Jeanette said.
And where, dear lady, is Louannec?
It is on the coast, Jeanette said, north of Lannion.
Lannion, eh?
He perched on a table's edge, his bare legs swinging.
Can't have you